Residents sleep through my rounds. Most, but not him. The old man in 217 never sleeps anymore. He sits on the edge of his narrow bed, thin fingers clutching the metal rail, speaking in hushed tones to that empty chair. They say grief does strange things to the mind. The other nurses whisper about it during shift changes. How he lost his wife 8 months ago comforts me with its normalcy. Tonight it feels like a countdown. Room 217's door stands slightly ajar. Through the gap I hear his voice, paper thin and trembling. I know, my dear. I know you're cold, but you have to understand I can't come yet. The nurses, they watch me. They give me pills that make my thoughts heavy. I pause outside, is to listen. The chair creaks, not the random protest of old wood, but deliberate movement. Back and forth, back and forth. I peer through the crack, and in the dim glow of his nightlight, I see him. He's leaning forward, both hands extended toward the rocker as if warming them over an invisible fire. His eyes track something I cannot see, moving in small jerks like he's following a conversation. No, I haven't forgotten, he continues, and there's something in his voice, not confusion but clarity. Perfect, terrible clarity. 53 years, remember? You wore that yellow dress, the one with the tiny flowers. You said the justice of the peace had the kindest eyes. The chair rocks faster. I push the door open, and immediately the motion stops. The old man's hands drop to his lap, and he turns to me with eyes that hold too much awareness for someone supposedly lost to dementia. Evening medication, I say, holding up the small paper cup with his pills. He takes them without protest, swallows them dry. His throat works with difficulty, Adam's apple bobbing like something trapped trying to escape. When he hands the cup back, his fingers brush mine. They're ice cold. She doesn't like you, he says quietly. Who doesn't? His gaze drifts to the chair. She says you smell wrong, like disinfectant and fear. She says you're the reason she can only visit at night now. During the day, there are too many of you. Too much noise. Too much life. I should document this. Classic symptoms. Hallucinations. Paranoid ideation. Emotional transference. But something keeps me standing there, looking at that perfectly still chair. What's her name? I ask, though I've read his file a dozen times. Margaret. The name comes out like a prayer. She's wearing the blue dress tonight. The one I bought her for our 40th anniversary. She's beautiful. Can't you see her? I look at the chair. Really look at it. The wood is worn smooth where hands would rest. The seat bears the permanent impression of a body, though no one's supposed to use that chair. It's been in storage for months, only recently moved to his room at his insistence. I should go, I say, but my feet don't move. She wants to know about your mother, he says suddenly. The paper cup crumples in my hand. What? Your mother. She says she's waiting. She's been trying to tell you, but you take pills too. Different ones. Ones that keep you from seeing. My mouth goes dry. I do take pills. Anxiety medication. Started after Mom died last year. Started after I began working nights. Started after I began seeing things in my peripheral vision that shouldn't be there. You're confused, I manage, backing toward the door. The medication keeps us here, he interrupts, and for a moment his voice isn't thin at all. It's strong, certain, desperate. Don't you understand? We're the ones who are trapped. They are free. They come and go as they please, but we're held down by chemistry, by synapses firing in predetermined patterns, by the weight of what you call reality. The chair begins to rock again. Slow, deliberate. I flee. The hallway feels wrong now. Too bright, too solid. I lean against the nurse's station, trying to slow my racing heart. The other nurse on duty, a woman whose name I should know but can't recall, glances up from her crossword. You okay? You look pale. Fine. Just the old man in 217. He's getting worse. She sets down her pen. Which old man? Room 217. The widower. Her face scrunches in confusion. 217's been empty for 2 weeks. Ever since. She stops, color draining from her cheeks. You didn't know? The old man died. Heart failure. They found him in that old rocking chair we'd put in storage. No one knows how he got it into his room. The fluorescent light above us flickers. In the moment of darkness, I swear I hear it. The steady creak of wood on wood. Rhythmic, patient, waiting. I return to 217, have to. The door's still ajar, and through it spills a warm golden light that shouldn't exist. The overhead fixture's been broken for days. Inside, the old man sits on his bed, just as I left him. But now he's smiling, and his eyes are focused on the chair with such love it makes my chest ache. She says it's almost time, he tells me. She says you understand now. The pills, they're wearing off, aren't they? You're starting to see. Your mother, she's been so patient. She rocks in the chair in the break room sometimes. Haven't you noticed? That old wooden chair nobody remembers buying? I have noticed. God help me, I have. Why? I whisper. Why show me this? He stands slowly, joints protesting, walks to the chair, places a hand on its back, and under his touch it stills. Because someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember. When I'm gone, and I will be soon, someone needs to tell them that death isn't an ending. It's just a change in perspective. The dead don't leave. We do. We leave them behind in our rush to forget, to medicate, to rationalize. But they wait. In empty chairs and quiet corners and the spaces between heartbeats. They wait for us to remember how to see. The golden light intensifies. The chair rocks faster now, violent almost, as if agitated. And in its motion, I begin to see her. Just an outline at first, like heat shimmer, then more solid. An elderly woman in a blue dress, her face kind but urgent, her mouth moving with words I can't quite hear. The old man reaches for her, and she reaches back, and when their fingers touch, the light goes out. When I fumble for my phone's flashlight, he's on the floor. No pulse, no breath. The emergency code I call brings a rush of feet, a flurry of CPR that we all know is pointless. Time of death, 3:17 a.m. But the chair still rocks. I quit the next morning, told them family emergency, packed my apartment in a day, drove until the highway ended, found a new job in a clinic, day shift only, no elderly patients, no long-term care. I threw away my anxiety medication. Better to see clearly, I reasoned. Better to know. But clarity, I'm learning, is its own kind of horror. Because now I see them everywhere. In waiting rooms and bus stops, in libraries and laundromats, empty chairs that aren't empty, rocking chairs that move without wind. And sometimes, if I'm very quiet and very still, I can almost hear what they're trying to say. Last week I found an antique store. Don't know why I entered. Something drew me in. In the back corner, covered in dust and draped in cobwebs, sat a familiar oak rocking chair. The same wear patterns, the same impression in the seat. The owner, an ancient woman with clouded eyes, smiled when she saw me looking. "That one's not for sale," she said. "It belongs to someone. They'll come for it when they're ready." As I turned to leave, she called after me. "Your mother says hello. Says she's proud of you for finally seeing. Says the chair in your apartment, the one you don't remember buying. She likes that one. Good view of your bed." I ran. But you can't run from empty chairs. They're everywhere, waiting. And late at night, when the world gets quiet enough, they all begin to rock in unison. A wooden symphony of the waiting dead, keeping time until we're ready to see who's sitting in them. The chair in my apartment started rocking yesterday. I've stopped trying not to look. Story 2. The house had been in my family for 3 generations, and in all that time, no one had ever bothered to explain why we called him Philippe. I inherited the place after my grandmother passed, a sprawling Victorian that squatted on the edge of town like something that had crawled up from the earth and decided to stay. The locals avoided it, not out of fear exactly, but with the same instinctive caution you'd show a sleeping dog of uncertain temperament. I moved in during late October, when the trees were already bare and the sky pressed down like a gray wool blanket. The first month passed without incident. I busied myself with repairs. The house groaned and settled constantly, its bones protesting the weight of years. The floorboards in the hallway had developed a particular vocabulary of creaks that I learned to interpret. This one meant the temperature was dropping. That one warned of coming rain. Old houses talk, my grandmother used to say. You just have to learn their language. It was December when I first saw him. I'd been sleeping fitfully, caught in that liminal space between dream and waking where thoughts become liquid and reality bends at the edges. Something pulled me toward consciousness. Not a sound exactly, but a feeling, like static electricity building before a storm. My eyes opened to darkness so complete it felt solid, pressing against my face like black velvet. The old alarm clock on the nightstand glowed. 3:47 a.m. I lay there, listening to the house's nocturnal monologue of settling timber and expanding pipes, when movement outside the window caught my eye. A figure stood in the yard below, barely visible in the moonless night. Just a darker shape against the darkness, human-sized and motionless. My heart began its familiar anxiety drumbeat, but I forced myself to sit up, to look closer. Probably just someone lost or drunk, wandering through the property. It happened sometimes. The house sat between the last bar in town and the trailer park beyond the woods, but as my eyes adjusted, details emerged that made my skin prickle with unease. The figure wore what looked like overalls or coveralls, the kind mechanics or farmers wore decades ago. He stood perfectly still facing my window, and though I couldn't make out his features in the darkness, I had the distinct impression he was looking directly at me. Then he raised his hand, not in a normal wave, but in that peculiar way small children do, fingers splayed, hand rotating at the wrist in an almost mechanical motion. The gesture was so incongruous, so bizarrely cheerful in the pre-dawn darkness, that I actually laughed. A short, nervous bark of sound that seemed too loud in the silence. The figure continued waving for perhaps 10 seconds, then simply turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the house with unhurried steps. I sat there for a long time, heart gradually slowing, trying to rationalize what I'd seen, a neighbor perhaps, though the nearest house was a quarter-mile away, someone playing a prank, though I couldn't imagine who or why. Eventually, exhaustion won over curiosity, and I fell back into uneasy sleep. I might have dismissed it as a strange dream if not for what I found the next morning. In the frost-covered grass below my window, a single set of footprints led to a spot directly beneath my room. They stopped there, no approaching tracks, no departing ones. Just two perfect boot prints in the white crystals, as if someone had been dropped from the sky, stood there briefly, then simply ceased to exist. 3 nights later, he returned. This time I was already awake, unable to sleep after spending the day researching the house's history at the local library. I'd found nothing unusual. Built in 1892, a succession of unremarkable owners. No murders or tragedies worth noting, but the librarian, an ancient woman with clouded eyes, had given me a strange look when I mentioned the address. The clock read 3:33 a.m. when that familiar sensation crept over me. The feeling of being observed, of becoming the focus of an attention that felt both intense and utterly alien. I moved to the window before I could think better of it. He stood in the same spot, wearing the same overalls. This time, faint moonlight illuminated more details. The fabric looked old, faded to an indeterminate color between blue and gray. His face remained shadowed, but I could make out the general shape, round, almost moon-like in its paleness. He waved again, that same childlike gesture, fingers wiggling independently like pale worms. But this time, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. His other hand hung at his side, and it was making the same motion. Both hands, waving in perfect synchronization, though only one was raised. I stumbled back from the window, my knee catching the corner of the nightstand. The lamp crashed to the floor, bulb shattering with a pop that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. When I looked back, he was gone. No footprints this time. I checked as soon as the sun rose, searched the entire yard. Nothing. I started keeping a journal, documenting each appearance. He came every 3 to 4 nights, always between 3 and 4 a.m., always in the same spot, always waving with that mechanical, almost parodic cheerfulness. I tried photographing him once, but the images showed only darkness, though I could see him clearly with my naked eye. I tried staying awake, watching from the window, but he never appeared when I was waiting, only when I was in bed, only when I was on the edge of sleep. It was during the 3rd week of these visitations that I invited my college roommate to stay for a weekend. I hadn't told him about the waving man. How could I? But I desperately needed another person in the house, someone to anchor me to normalcy. We stayed up late that Friday, drinking beer and reminiscing. Around 2 a.m., he headed to the guest room on the 2nd floor, the one my grandmother had always kept ready for visitors. I lay awake, waiting, wondering if the presence of another person would keep my mysterious visitor away. At 3:41 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway, not the house's usual settling sounds, but deliberate, measured steps. They stopped outside my door. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat, taste copper in my mouth. The doorknob didn't turn, but I sensed presence on the other side, patient and waiting. Then the footsteps continued down the hall toward the guest room. I should have gotten up, should have called out, warned my friend, done something. But a paralyzing certainty held me in place, the absolute conviction that if I left my bed, if I opened that door, something fundamental would change. Some boundary would be crossed that could never be uncrossed. The next morning, my friend looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes. When I asked how he'd slept, he laughed nervously and said he'd had the strangest experience. Around 3:30, he'd woken to find someone standing outside his window, waving at him. An older man in work clothes, friendly looking, but somehow wrong. The way he'd waved, my friend said, shuddering slightly, like his joints weren't quite connected right. That's when I finally told him about my experiences. His face went pale as I spoke, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me something that made my blood turn to ice water. His window faced the back of the house. My window faced the front. We searched the property together that afternoon, looking for any sign of multiple visitors, any explanation that didn't involve accepting the impossible. We found nothing. My friend left earlier than planned, and I didn't blame him. As he drove away, he rolled down his window and called out something that stuck with me. Maybe you should ask your family about Philippe. The name hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't mentioned it. Hadn't told him that's what my grandmother called the thing she claimed was harmless. Just a spirit that liked to check on the family. But somehow, he knew. I called my mother that evening, trying to keep my voice casual as I asked about the house's history, about any stories grandmother might have told. She was quiet for so long I thought the connection had dropped. Then, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard her use, she said she'd hoped it had stopped with grandmother's death. Philippe had been visiting the family for as long as anyone could remember. Her grandmother had seen him, her grandmother's mother, always the same, a man in overalls, waving from the yard in the deep of night. Always harmless, she insisted, almost frantically. Never hurt anyone, just watched, just waved. But then she said something that made me understand why she'd never wanted to inherit the house, why she'd been so eager for me to take it instead. Sometimes, she said, on the very darkest nights, Philippe wasn't outside the window. Sometimes he was inside the room, standing at the foot of the bed, still waving, still smiling with a face that looked almost human but not quite. Like someone had tried to draw a person from memory and gotten the proportions subtly, horribly wrong. And on those nights you couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only lie there and watch him wave and wave and wave until dawn finally came and he simply wasn't there anymore. That was a week ago. I've started sleeping with the lights on, but it doesn't help. The shadows still pool in the corners, and in those shadows, sometimes, I see movement. A hand perhaps, fingers splayed in greeting. I've considered leaving, but something tells me it wouldn't matter. Philippe isn't tied to the house. He's tied to us, to the family, following some obligation or compulsion I don't understand. Last night, I woke to find my bedroom door open. I know I'd locked it. I always lock it now. The hallway beyond was dark, but not empty. I could feel him out there, waiting. The air felt thick, charged with potential energy like the moment before lightning strikes. Then I heard it. Footsteps approaching my bed. Slow, measured, deliberate. The floorboards creaked their familiar song, but underneath was something else. A soft dragging sound, like fabric brushing against wood, or like someone not quite lifting their feet when they walk. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle rigid with terror, as the footsteps stopped beside my bed. The mattress dipped slightly, as if someone had placed a hand on it for balance. The air grew cold, carrying a smell like old cloth and earth and something sweet-sick underneath. When I finally forced my eyes open, he was there, not outside, not in the doorway, standing right beside my bed, close enough that I could see the individual threads in his coveralls, worn thin with age. Close enough to see that the fabric wasn't faded. It was stained, covered in patches of something dark that might have been oil or might have been something else entirely. His face. I can't describe his face. Not because I didn't see it, but because what I saw doesn't translate into words. It was like looking at a reflection in disturbed water, features constantly shifting, never quite resolving into anything fully human. But he was smiling. That much was clear. Smiling and waving, that grotesque childhood gesture now performed inches from my face. I couldn't move, couldn't even close my eyes again, could only lie there as he waved and waved, those fingers moving independently, boneless and wrong. Sometimes I thought I heard him speaking, but the words came from inside my skull rather than through my ears. A litany of names, generations of my family stretching back and back and back. When dawn finally came, seeping gray through the windows, he simply stopped existing. Not disappeared. Stopped existing, like a film cutting to black. The only evidence of his presence was the depression in the mattress that took long minutes to fade, and a smell like cemetery earth that lingered for hours. I'm writing this in the afternoon light, trying to capture the experience while it's still fresh, though part of me wonders if documenting it somehow makes it more real, gives it power. The sun is already sinking toward the horizon, painting long shadows across the floor. Soon it will be dark. Soon it will be 3 a.m. again. I've been thinking about what my mother said, about how Philippe has always been with the family, about how my grandmother called him harmless, just checking on us, but checking for what? Waiting for what? Last night, just before he vanished with the dawn, I could have sworn I heard him speak one clear word, though his mouth never moved. A word that wasn't quite invitation and wasn't quite threat, but something between the two. Soon. I don't know what happens when whatever Philippe is waiting for finally arrives. I don't know if he's guardian or herald, protector or patient predator. All I know is that the sun is setting and the shadows are growing longer, and somewhere in the darkness between 3 and 4 a.m., he'll be there, waving, smiling, waiting. And I'm starting to think that one night, maybe tonight, maybe years from now, I won't be in my bed when morning comes. The house will be empty, another mysterious disappearance in a long line of unremarkable owners. And years later, someone else will inherit this place. We'll see a figure in overalls waving from the yard, and their family will tell them about harmless old Philippe. But there will be two figures waving then, two sets of hands making that childlike gesture in perfect synchronization. I wonder if I'll remember my name. I wonder if I'll remember why I'm waving. I wonder if I'll want to stop. The sun just dipped below the horizon. The house is beginning its evening conversation of creaks and sighs. And in the growing darkness, I swear I can already see him out there, patient as stone, certain as sunrise, waiting, always waiting. Tonight feels different somehow. The air is thick with expectation, and I find myself almost eager for 3 a.m. to arrive. Not with fear anymore, but with a strange anticipation I don't fully understand. My hands keep moving to wave at nothing, fingers wiggling of their own accord. Maybe that's how it happens. Not with violence or terror, but with slow acceptance, with the gradual realization that you were always meant to join them, that every generation has someone who finally understands what Philippe has been trying to tell us all along. The clock on my nightstand reads 11:47 p.m. soon. Story 3. The emergency room lights hurt my eyes even through closed lids. I kept them shut, listening to the chaos around me, rubber soles squeaking against linoleum, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, my wife's broken sobbing somewhere to my left. They said our son had been underwater for almost 4 minutes. They said his heart had stopped for 2. They said we were lucky. Lucky. The word tasted wrong in my mouth, metallic and sharp like the antiseptic smell that clung to everything in this place. When they finally let us see him, he looked so small in that hospital bed, dwarfed by machines and wires. His chest rose and fell steadily now, a motion I'd never take for granted again. The doctor, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, explained that while the preliminary scans looked promising, we'd need to monitor him closely for any neurological effects. Children's brains, she said, were remarkably resilient, but near-drowning experiences could sometimes result in changes. I should have paid more attention to that pause before changes. He woke up 3 hours later, just as the sun was setting, painting the sterile white walls in shades of amber and blood. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then suddenly sharp and alert in a way that made my skin prickle. He didn't cry. He didn't call for us. He just stared at the corner of the room, near the ventilation grate, and smiled. My wife squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face as she whispered his name over and over, but he kept looking at that corner, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. Then, in a voice hoarse from the intubation tube, he spoke. "Veronica says it's not time yet." The words hung in the air like frost. My wife's hand went to her mouth, her wedding ring catching the dying light. Neither of us had mentioned that name in years. It belonged to her grandmother, dead for over a decade, buried before our son was even conceived. There were no pictures of her in our house, no stories shared. She was a ghost we'd deliberately kept buried, her memory tainted by the circumstances of her final years, the dementia, the accusations she'd make about seeing things that weren't there, the violent outbursts that had necessitated her institutionalization. The doctor assured us that confusion was normal after such trauma. Children often experienced vivid dreams or hallucinations during recovery. We nodded, clinging to the explanation like a life raft, even as something cold and ancient seemed to settle into the room's corners. We brought him home 2 days later. The house felt different immediately, though I couldn't articulate why. Maybe it was the way shadows seemed to linger longer in doorways, or how the air felt thicker, harder to breathe. I told myself it was just parental anxiety, the hypervigilance that comes after almost losing everything. But then the conversation started. I'd find him in his playroom, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, nodding seriously at empty air. His toys remained untouched, arranged in neat lines like an audience. When I asked who he was talking to, he'd look at me with those 2 bright eyes and say she was teaching him things. Important things. Things about what happens in the dark spaces between seconds, in the hollow moments when hearts stop beating. My wife began sleeping in his room, curled in the rocking chair we'd bought when he was born. She said she wanted to be close in case he needed anything, but I knew the truth. She heard them too, the whispers that seemed to seep through the walls after midnight, conversations in a voice that was both our son's and not our son's, layered with something older, hungrier. I started researching. Late nights hunched over my laptop while the house creaked around me, diving into medical journals about near-death experiences in children. The clinical terms provided some comfort: hypoxic brain injury, temporal lobe seizures, hallucinatory paracusia. I printed articles, highlighted passages, built a fortress of rational explanations against the growing certainty that something had followed our son back from wherever he'd gone during those 2 minutes of stillness. Then I found the photograph. It was buried in a box of my wife's family belongings, yellowed and creased but still clear enough to make my hands shake. Veronica stood in what looked like a garden, wearing a blue dress with small white flowers. The same dress, my wife later confirmed with a voice barely above a whisper, that she'd been buried in. The same dress our son had described in perfect detail when I'd finally asked him what his invisible friend looked like. The changes accelerated after that. He stopped eating regular food, pushing away plates with a polite but firm refusal, saying she had told him about better sustenance. I'd find him in the basement at strange hours, pressing his small hands against the concrete walls, murmuring about feeling the heartbeat of the house. His drawings, once cheerful scribbles of dogs and sunshine, became intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. Geometric designs that seemed to shift when you weren't watching them straight on. My wife stopped talking about it altogether. She moved through the days like a sleepwalker, her movements automatic and precise. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at nothing, her lips moving soundlessly, and I wondered if she was praying or if she too had started hearing the whispers. The pediatric psychiatrist we consulted spoke about trauma responses in temporary dissociative states. She prescribed mild sedatives and therapy sessions. But during his first appointment, our son had looked at her with that unsettling smile and told her about the white moths that lived in her lungs, about the shadow that followed her home every night. The doctor's face had drained of color, and she'd excused herself, returning with a referral to a colleague who specialized in more complex cases. We never went. The house began to change around us, subtle shifts that you could almost dismiss if you weren't paying attention. Doors that had opened inward now opened outward. The basement stairs, which I could have sworn numbered 13, now had 14. The water from the taps ran colder, and sometimes, if you looked at it from the right angle, it seemed to flow upward for a fraction of a second before gravity remembered its job. I started sleeping in my office, unable to bear the weight of the darkness in our bedroom. But even there, surrounded by the mundane anchors of work and normalcy, I felt watched. The sensation was strongest in the moments just before dawn, when the world felt thin and permeable. I'd wake to find my computer on, displaying images I hadn't searched for, medical photographs of drowned children, their eyes clouded and mouths open in silent screams. The browser history would be empty. My wife found me one morning, standing in our son's doorway, though I had no memory of getting up. She said I'd been there for hours, just watching him sleep, my lips moving in response to questions only I could hear. When she touched my shoulder, I apparently turned to her and, in a voice she swore wasn't quite mine, told her that Veronica was getting impatient. That was when I noticed the photographs throughout the house had started to change. Family pictures where faces seemed to blur if you looked too long. Holiday snapshots where shadows fell in impossible directions. In one, a photo from our son's 3rd birthday, there was now a figure in the background that hadn't been there before. A woman in a blue dress with white flowers, her face turned away, but her posture suggesting she was watching, waiting. I tried to destroy them, but they reappeared in their frames overnight, sometimes with new additions. More figures in blue dresses, multiplying like a virus through our documented memories. My wife pretended not to notice, but I saw her avoid looking at the walls when she walked through the hallway. Our son grew quieter but somehow more present. He'd appear in rooms without entering them, would know things he couldn't possibly know. He told me about the dream I'd had the night before, described in perfect detail the nightmare where I was drowning in water that wasn't water, surrounded by faces that weren't quite faces. He patted my hand with his small fingers and told me not to worry, that Veronica said the adjustment period was always difficult. I started recording our conversations, hoping to find some pattern or logic in his impossible statements. But when I played them back, the recordings were different. His voice was there, but underneath it, sometimes overlapping it, was another voice. Older. Feminine. Speaking in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood in the deep, primitive parts of my brain that remembered being prey. The breaking point came during a family dinner. We were pretending everything was normal, the three of us around the table like a grotesque pantomime of domestic life. Our son hadn't touched his food as usual, but sat politely with his hands folded. My wife moved her fork mechanically from plate to mouth, chewing nothing. I realized she hadn't actually eaten anything in days. Then our son turned to me, his eyes reflecting the overhead light in a way that made them look silver, and said she wanted to thank us. "For what?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "For the invitation," he replied. "For making room." That night, I couldn't bring myself to enter the house. I sat in my car in the driveway watching the windows. Every light was on, but the illumination seemed wrong, too blue, like the glow from underwater. Shadows moved across the curtains, too many shadows for just two people. As I watched, the front door opened. No one came out, but I knew it was an invitation. I drove to a motel instead, spending the night in a room that smelled of cigarettes and industrial cleaner, infinitely preferable to the expanding wrongness of home. But even there, 40 miles away, I woke to find a message written in the condensation on the bathroom mirror. "She says you can't uninvite family." When I returned the next morning, the house felt settled in a way it hadn't since the hospital. My wife was making breakfast, humming a tune I didn't recognize. Our son sat at the table, drawing with crayons, the picture looking almost normal if you didn't notice how the proportions were subtly incorrect, how the smiling figures had too many joints in their arms. They both looked up when I entered, their movements perfectly synchronized. My wife smiled, but her eyes were empty, reflecting nothing. Our son put down his crayon and, in that layered voice that was his and not his, told me that Veronica had decided to stay, that she'd been lonely for so long, trapped in the space between heartbeats, waiting for someone to die just long enough to notice her, to carry her back. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to never look back. But I saw my son's face underneath whatever was wearing it, caught glimpses of the child he'd been in the moments when whatever controlled him seemed to flicker. He was still in there, somewhere, trapped like an insect in amber. So I stayed. I write this in the kitchen while they sleep, though I'm no longer certain if sleep is the right word for what they do at night. The house breathes around me, its rhythm different now, synced to something older than human habitation. Sometimes I hear my own voice coming from other rooms, having conversations I'm not having. Sometimes I answer. The doctors would say it's shared psychosis, a family system delusion born from trauma. Maybe they're right. Maybe the carbon monoxide detector I disabled last week was malfunctioning for a reason. Maybe the scratching in the walls is just mice, even though it sounds like fingernails. Maybe the fact that my reflection sometimes moves a fraction of a second before I do means nothing at all. But I know what I know. My son drowned for 2 minutes. In those 2 minutes, something else slipped through the cracked door between life and death. It wore my wife's grandmother's name and face, but I don't think it was ever really her. I think it was something that had been wearing her first, something that had driven her to madness and early death, something that needed a new host when the old one failed. Now it has 3. I should leave. Every rational part of me knows this, but rationality feels thin here, like ice over deep water. And beneath that ice, something vast and patient waits, knowing that eventually we all sink. We all drown. We all make room. My wife is calling me from upstairs now, though I can see her through the window, still standing in the garden where she's been for the last hour, perfectly still, facing the house. Our son laughs somewhere above me, the sound coming from multiple rooms simultaneously. The invitation has been extended. The family grows. And somewhere, in the corner of my vision where things blur and reshape, a woman in a blue dress with white flowers smiles, knowing she'll never be lonely again. I go to join them. After all, Veronica says it's time. Story 4. The house stood like a tombstone against the Oklahoma sky, its Victorian bones bleached by decades of prairie sun. 3 stories of weathered limestone and warped wood, crowned with a widow's walk that no one had climbed in years. Fort Sill's historic housing office called it Quarters 7, but the moment I stepped through its threshold, I understood why the previous 3 families had requested transfers within months. The air inside hung thick and stale, despite the maintenance crew's recent visit. My wife followed me in, her heels clicking against original hardwood that groaned like ship timbers. Behind us, movers struggled with boxes marked fragile and kitchen, their faces already glazed with sweat in the August heat. I watched them work, noting how they unconsciously avoided lingering in certain spots, how their conversations died when they entered the parlor. Built in 1871, Quarters 7 had housed cavalry officers when Fort Sill was still frontier territory. The realtor, a nervous lieutenant from housing, had rattled off its history like an apology. Original fixtures, hand-carved banisters, 12-foot ceilings. She'd mentioned the house's inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places, then quickly added that the Army had modernized all the important systems. New wiring, updated plumbing, central air that barely touched the oppressive weight of the rooms. That first night, we ate takeout on the living room floor, surrounded by towers of cardboard. My wife fell asleep against my shoulder while I studied the ceiling's pressed tin patterns, trying to ignore how shadows pooled in corners where walls met at impossible angles. The house settled around us with sounds I told myself were normal. Wood contracting, pipes adjusting, the language of old architecture adapting to new inhabitants. The radio static started 3 days later. I'd been unpacking my study when white noise erupted from the kitchen, not the gentle hiss of dead air, but aggressive static that rose and fell in patterns almost like breathing. I found my wife standing frozen by the counter, staring at our modern digital radio as its display flickered between frequencies never selected. She unplugged it. The static continued for 7 more seconds before cutting off mid-burst. We laughed about it afterward, nervous laughter that echoed wrong in the high-ceilinged rooms. Electronic interference from the base, we decided. All those radar installations and communication arrays. The explanation satisfied us enough to sleep, though I noticed she'd moved the radio to the garage. The footsteps began the second week. Heavy boots on hardwood, always on the floor above wherever we happened to be. If we were in the kitchen, they paced the master bedroom. In the bedroom, they circled the attic, always walking, never running, with the measured cadence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I checked every room, climbed into the musty attic with its exposed beams and pink insulation, even accessed the widow's walk through its paint-sealed door. Nothing. Just dust motes spinning in afternoon light, and the distant sound of artillery practice from the base's impact area. My wife started spending more time at the office. Contract negotiations, she said. New civilian personnel systems requiring overtime. But I saw how she relaxed when she left the house each morning, how her shoulders dropped as she backed down our driveway. I wanted to be angry, but I understood. The house was changing me too. I found myself checking locks multiple times before bed, testing doorknobs with increasing paranoia. The parlor's antique mirror drew my attention constantly. I'd catch myself staring into it, searching for movement in its mercury-spotted depths. Sometimes I thought I saw figures in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that vanished when I turned. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Exhaustion, stress from the move, adjustment to new surroundings. But rationality felt fragile in Quarter 7, especially after sunset. The lights started their dance in week 3, not flickering like bad wiring. This was deliberate, purposeful. Kitchen lights dimming as dining room sconces brightened. The chandelier in the foyer pulsing like a heartbeat while hallway fixtures strobed in sequence, an electrical symphony that played out over minutes, then stopped abruptly, leaving us in normal illumination that somehow felt threatening in its suddenness. I called base maintenance. The electrician, a grizzled sergeant major near retirement, spent 3 hours checking every outlet, junction box, and circuit breaker. His equipment showed perfect readings, textbook current flow, no irregularities. As he packed his tools, he paused at the front door. He told me I might want to visit the base museum, check out their local history section, particularly the displays about cavalry days. His tone suggested more than historical curiosity, but he left before I could press him. The museum occupied a converted barracks building near the old parade ground. Glass cases displayed artillery shells, uniforms under yellow light, photographs of stern men with magnificent mustaches. I found what the sergeant major had hinted at in a corner display labeled Fort Sill Folklore. The photograph was grainy, taken sometime in the 1890s. A cavalry officer in buckskin jacket and campaign hat, standing beside a horse in front of a familiar three-story house. The placard identified him as Captain James Hovey, killed in action during a Comanche raid in 1872. According to legend, his spirit still walked the grounds of Fort Sill, particularly around Quarter 7, his former residence. The museum curator, a civilian volunteer with enthusiasm for local history, filled in details the display omitted. 3 families before Hovey had lived in the house. All had left under mysterious circumstances. Madness, the record suggested, though Victorian doctors used that diagnosis liberally. After Hovey's death, the house stood empty for 2 years before the army could convince another officer to occupy it. She showed me other photographs, other documents, reports of lights and empty windows, complaints about footsteps from upstairs neighbors, except Quarter 7 had no upstairs neighbors. A 1923 investigation by the post chaplain that ended with his recommendation to demolish the structure. The army had refused. Too expensive, too much historical value. I asked her about recent incidents. She grew quiet, then mentioned the previous families. The first had lasted 8 months before the husband received emergency reassignment to Germany. The second made it 4 months. The wife had been hospitalized for what base medical carefully termed exhaustion. The third family's teenage son had fallen from the widow's walk, breaking both legs. He swore something had pushed him, though investigators found no evidence. That night I told my wife about the buckskin ghost. She listened while mechanically eating dinner, her eyes focused somewhere beyond the dining room wall. When I finished, she simply nodded and continued chewing. We'd stopped discussing the incidents. What was there to say? That we were being haunted? That we were losing our minds? Both explanations led nowhere good. The static returned at 2 a.m., but different this time. Voices emerged from the white noise, too distorted to understand, but unmistakably human. Multiple speakers, their words overlapping in urgent conversation. I crept downstairs to find every radio in the house broadcasting the same phantom discussion. The kitchen radio we'd hidden in the garage, the alarm clock radio in our bedroom, even the emergency weather radio still packed in a moving box. I stood in the living room, surrounded by electronic voices growing louder, more insistent. Individual words emerged from the chaos. Position, cavalry, sunrise, military terminology and accents from another century. The temperature dropped until my breath misted in August, and every hair on my body stood rigid. Then silence. Absolute crushing silence that felt more threatening than any noise. My wife appeared on the stairs, pale and shaking. Neither of us spoke. We simply stood there, 2 rational people confronting something that rationality couldn't touch. I saw my own terror reflected in her eyes, but also something else. Relief that someone else was witnessing this, that madness wasn't taking us individually. The footsteps started above us, not pacing this time but approaching. Measured, deliberate steps moving toward the stairs. Each footfall shook dust from the ceiling, though nothing that heavy should have been walking up there. My wife gripped my arm hard enough to bruise as the sound reached the top of the staircase. The steps began descending. I counted each one. The staircase had 17 steps. I'd counted them multiple times during sleepless nights. Heavy boots on wood, getting closer. 5 steps, 10, 15. They stopped at 17. Nothing stood at the bottom of the stairs, just empty space that felt occupied, charged with presence. The air shimmered like heat distortion, and I smelled leather and gunpowder, horse sweat and prairie dust. Scents from another time bleeding into our modern world. I stepped forward. My wife made a sound of protest, but I ignored her. 3 feet from the stairs I stopped and spoke to the empty air. I told the nothing that this was my house now, my family's home, that Captain Hovey or whoever stood in my foyer needed to accept that times had changed. The cavalry was gone. The frontier was settled. The war he'd fought had ended over a century ago. The shimmer intensified. For a moment, I swear I saw him. Tall, weathered, eyes like holes burned through reality. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. He wasn't threatening us. He was warning us. The presence faded like morning mist, taking the impossible cold with it. The house felt different afterward, not empty, but settled, accepting. The footsteps stopped that night, though sometimes I still heard them in the distance, patrolling boundaries I couldn't see. The lights ceased their dancing. The radio stayed silent. 7:15 became just an old house with old house sounds. We lasted 2 more months. Not because of Captain Hovey. I understood now that he'd been trying to protect us, standing guard as he had in life. The real problem was what he'd been guarding against. It started with the scratching inside the walls. Not mice or squirrels. The sound was too deliberate, too patterned. Like fingernails on wood, or claws, searching for weak points in the structure. The scratching followed us from room to room, always just behind the plaster, just out of sight. Then came the whispers from the basement. Not in English, not in any language I recognized. Guttural sounds that predated words, communications from something that had never been human. The basement door would swing open at night, inviting us down into darkness that seemed to breathe. My wife broke first. I found her one morning standing in the parlor, having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. Not Hovey. She insisted it was something else. Something that had been here before the house, before the fort, before human memory. It wanted in, she said. Had always wanted in. Hovey had kept it at bay, but we'd sent him away. I requested transfer that afternoon. The housing office processed it in record time. No questions, no penalties, just swift approval and movers scheduled for the next week. As we pulled away from 7:15 for the last time, I looked back at the widow's walk. A figure stood there, barely visible in the morning sun. Tall, wearing buckskin, watching us leave. I wanted to stop, to apologize, to beg him to keep holding the line. But my wife was muttering to invisible companions, and I needed to get her somewhere safe, somewhere sane. The base newsletter mentioned 7:15 twice more before I left Fort Sill. Once to announce its renovation into administrative offices. No one would live there again. The second time was a brief note about structural damage from an unexplained fire that started in the basement. The historic structure had been saved, but barely. I still dream about that house. In the dreams, I'm standing in the foyer while footsteps pace overhead. But now I understand they're not threats. They're patrols. Captain Hovey still walks his rounds, keeping watch against something older than the cavalry, older than the frontier. Something that scratches at the boundaries between worlds, looking for cracks to seep through. Sometimes on quiet nights I hear static on the radio. Just for a moment, voices almost break through the white noise. I listen for Hovey's voice among them, hoping he's still standing guard, hoping whatever he faces never finds another way in. But I know better than to tune in too closely. Some signals aren't meant for the living, and some guards stand watch precisely so we never have to know what they're watching for. Story 5. The digital clock's red glow burned through my eyelids. 4 a.m. Not 3:59, not 4:01, exactly 4 o'clock, as if the universe had appointed this specific moment for what was about to unfold. My body knew something was wrong before my mind caught up. Every nerve ending fired at once, flooding my system with that primal electricity that screams, "Turn around. Turn around now." I lay perfectly still, my breathing shallow, listening to the house breathe around me. The air conditioner's hum had stopped. When had it stopped? Leaving behind a suffocating silence that pressed against my eardrums. The darkness in my bedroom felt thicker than usual, almost viscous, as if the shadows had gained substance while I slept. My neck muscles tensed as I began to turn my head toward the doorway. The movement felt like pushing through water, each degree of rotation requiring conscious effort. The doorframe materialized first, a vertical slice of deeper black against the charcoal darkness of the hallway beyond. Then I saw it. A figure stood in my doorway, tall enough that its head nearly touched the frame. It wasn't moving, not exactly, but there was something about its stillness that suggested coiled potential, like a spring compressed to its breaking point. The darkness obscured details, but I could make out the general shape. Humanoid, but wrong. proportions stretched in ways that made my eyes water trying to process them. My heart hammered against my ribs as the figure began to lean forward, not stepping but tilting into my room, as if testing the boundaries of the space. The floorboards didn't creak under its weight. Nothing creaked. The silence was so complete I could hear the blood rushing through my veins, could hear my pupils dilating in the dark. Then I made the mistake. I gasped. The sound barely escaped my lips, just a tiny intake of breath. But the figure's reaction was instantaneous and violent. It didn't run so much as fold itself backward, limbs bending at angles that shouldn't exist, scuttling on all fours into the corner of my room where the walls met the ceiling. The movement was spider quick, a blur of wrong geometry that my brain refused to fully process. And then, nothing. The corner was empty. The thing had simply ceased to be there, as if it had never existed at all. I lay frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, waiting for it to reappear, waiting for something, anything, to happen. When nothing did, I finally found the courage to reach for the bedside lamp. The light flooded the room, revealing absolutely nothing out of place. The corner where the thing had disappeared showed no signs of disturbance. The doorway stood empty, just a rectangular passage to the hallway beyond. Sleep didn't return that night. How could it? I sat propped against my headboard, eyes locked on that corner, watching shadows shift with each passing car's headlights. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it was sleep paralysis, a particularly vivid nightmare, anything but what my instincts insisted it had been. The next few nights passed without incident. I began to relax, even laughed about it with a coworker who suggested I lay off the late-night horror podcasts. But on the fourth night, I woke again at exactly 4 a.m. This time, I didn't need to turn my head. I could feel it watching me from somewhere in the room, not the doorway, somewhere closer. My eyes darted around the darkness, searching for that telltale wrongness in the shadows. The presence was palpable, like static electricity before a storm. Every hair on my body stood at attention. I forced myself to speak, my voice cracking in the silence. "What do you want?" The darkness seemed to pulse, and for a moment I thought I heard something. Not quite breathing, not quite whispering, but something organic and wet, like tissue paper being slowly torn underwater. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me in a cocoon of wrongness. Then movement in my peripheral vision. Not in the corner this time, but along the wall to my right, something sliding against the paint with a sound like fingernails on silk. I whipped my head toward it, but again, nothing. Just the wall, innocent and bare. This became my new reality. Every few nights, sometimes consecutive, sometimes with gaps that left me wondering if it was over, I would wake at 4 a.m. to find that presence in my room. Sometimes it stood in the doorway, sometimes it crouched in different corners. Once, I swear I felt it standing directly beside my bed, close enough that I should have felt its breath on my face, if it breathed at all. I tried everything. I installed motion sensors that never triggered. I set up a camera that showed nothing but me, alone, talking to empty air. I even tried sleeping in different rooms, but it didn't matter. At 4 a.m., if it decided to visit, it would find me. The sleep deprivation began to take its toll. My work suffered. My relationships frayed. My reflection in the mirror showed hollow eyes and skin like wax paper. People started avoiding me, claiming I made them uncomfortable, that being around me felt like standing too close to a high-voltage wire. I researched everything I could find about sleep disturbances, shadow people, dimensional bleeding, anything that might explain what was happening. The internet offered 1,000 theories, but no solutions. Some sites suggested I was being visited by something from another plane of existence, visible only in that liminal space between sleep and waking. Others insisted I was experiencing the onset of schizophrenia, that the figure was a projection of my fracturing mind. The uncertainty was maddening. Was I losing my mind, or was something genuinely stalking me in those pre-dawn hours? The evidence suggested the former, but every instinct in my body screamed the latter. 3 weeks into this ordeal, something changed. I woke not at 4 a.m. but at 3:47. The room felt different, charged with anticipation. I could sense it approaching, not from outside, but from somewhere else, somewhere adjacent to reality. The air grew thick, almost syrupy, and breathing became an effort. At 3:59, the temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath misting in the darkness. The walls began to make subtle sounds, like wood expanding and contracting, like the house itself was trying to accommodate something that didn't quite fit in three-dimensional space. At exactly 4 o'clock, it materialized not in the doorway but at the foot of my bed. This time, the darkness didn't obscure it completely. I could make out details that my mind struggled to assemble into a coherent image. Too many joints in its limbs, skin that seemed to shift between solid and vapor, and where its face should have been. A smooth expanse broken only by what might have been eyes, or holes where eyes had been removed. It tilted its head, if head was the right word, and I heard that wet paper sound again, closer now, emanating from the thing itself. Slowly, deliberately, it raised what might have been an arm and pointed at the corner where it had first disappeared. I followed its gesture and saw that the corner was wrong. The angles didn't meet properly. Where two walls and the ceiling should have formed a neat intersection, there was instead a subtle warping, as if space itself had developed a fold. The thing at the foot of my bed made that sound again, more insistent now, still pointing. Against every screaming instinct, I got out of bed and approached the corner. The closer I got, the more pronounced the distortion became. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that matched neither my heartbeat nor my breathing. When I was within arm's reach, I saw it. A gap, no wider than a piece of paper, running along where the walls met. Through it leaked a darkness deeper than anything in my room, a darkness that seemed to pull at my vision. I turned back to the figure, but it was already moving. That horrible spider scuttle that defied physics, heading straight for the gap. As it reached the corner, its body began to compress, to fold in on itself in ways that made my stomach churn. It was showing me, I realized, showing me how it entered and exited my room. With a final wet sound that might have been communication, or might have been the noise of matter being forced through an impossible space, it disappeared into the gap. The corner immediately returned to normal, angles meeting properly, no sign of the spatial distortion that had been there moments before. I stood there until dawn, watching that corner, waiting. But I already knew it wouldn't return that night. It had shown me what I needed to see. The question was, why? The next day, I called in sick to work and spent hours examining that corner. In daylight, it looked perfectly normal. I pushed furniture against it, ran my hands along the walls, even tried prying at the edges with a screwdriver. Nothing. But I knew what I had seen. That night, I waited. 4 a.m. came and went without incident. The next night, the same. For a week, nothing happened, and I began to wonder if showing me the gap had been its way of saying goodbye. But on the 8th night, I woke at 4 a.m. to find not one figure, but 3, standing in different corners of my room. They didn't move, didn't make that wet paper sound. They simply stood there, watching me with their not faces, their impossible bodies creating subtle distortions in the air around them. And I understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins, that they were waiting for something, waiting for me to make a choice. I could feel the corner calling to me, that spot where reality wore thin. The sensation was almost physical, a tugging at the base of my skull, an itch behind my eyes that could only be scratched by looking at that impossible gap. Part of me, a part that grew larger each night, wanted to go to it, to press my face against that fold in space and peer through to whatever lay beyond. The 3 figures remained motionless as I fought this urge, their presence neither threatening nor comforting, simply expectant. When the sun finally rose and they faded away, I was exhausted not from fear but from resistance. This is my reality now. Every few nights they return, sometimes one, sometimes several, always at exactly 4 a.m. They don't threaten or attack. They simply wait, patient as stones, while that corner calls to me with increasing insistence. The gap hasn't reappeared, but I can feel it there, just beneath the surface of what my eyes perceive, waiting to open again if I just ask it to. I've stopped trying to document these visits. The cameras show nothing, the motion sensors remain silent, And anyone I've tried to have stay over reports sleeping soundly through the night while I lie awake, surrounded by impossible geometries made flesh. My therapist has prescribed antipsychotics, but I haven't filled the prescription. Part of me fears they would work, that the figures would disappear, and I would never know if they were real or delusion. Another part fears they wouldn't work at all. Last night, there were 5 of them. They filled my room. Their not breathing creating a white noise that almost sounded like words. The corner pulsed with invisible energy, and for the first time, I got out of bed and walked toward it. The figures shifted slightly, perhaps eagerly, as I approached. When I reached out my hand, I could feel the wrongness there, the place where my reality had been worn thin by their repeated passages. I didn't touch it. Not yet. But I stood there until dawn, my fingers inches from that hidden fold, while the things watched and waited. They know, I think, that it's only a matter of time. Each visit weakens my resolve a little more. Each 4 a.m. awakening makes the impossible seem a little more possible, makes the gap seem a little more like a door than a wound. I don't know what's on the other side. I don't know if these things are trying to warn me, recruit me, or simply observe my slow dissolution. I don't even know if they're real, or if I'm documenting my own descent into madness. All I know is that tonight, when 4 a.m. comes, and it will come, it always comes, I'll wake to find them waiting. And that corner will call to me again, promising answers to questions I'm not sure I should be asking. The truth is, I'm tired. Tired of fighting, tired of questioning, tired of existing in this liminal space between sanity and something else. Maybe tonight I'll finally give in. Maybe tonight I'll touch that fold in space and see what happens. Maybe tonight I'll follow them through the gap and discover whether I've been haunted or whether I've been slowly fragmenting, creating elaborate delusions to explain some fundamental break in my psyche. Or maybe I'll continue to resist, to lie there surrounded by impossibilities, neither fully in their world nor fully in mine, forever balanced on the edge of a revelation that might destroy everything I thought I knew about reality. The clock on my nightstand reads 3:58 a.m. I can already feel the air changing, thickening with anticipation. In 2 minutes, I'll know if tonight is the night they finally come for me, or if it's the night I finally go to them. I suppose, in the end, there might not be a difference. Story 6. The cats knew something I didn't. It started 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday that felt heavier than it should have. I was working from home, laptop balanced on my knees, when I noticed both of them, my tabbies, frozen in that peculiar way cats freeze when they've spotted prey. But they weren't looking at the window where birds sometimes perched. They were staring at the corner where the living room wall met the kitchen entrance. The empty corner. Their pupils were dilated to black pools, tails twitching in slow, measured beats. Then, without warning, they attacked. Claws extended, they launched themselves at nothing, hissing and spitting at the bare wall. I dropped my laptop, the clatter breaking whatever spell held them. They scattered, disappearing into the bedroom, leaving me staring at that corner, at the absolutely nothing that was there. I should have moved out then, should have packed everything and left. But you don't abandon your home because your cats have one weird moment. You rationalize. You tell yourself they saw a shadow, heard a mouse in the walls, caught a scent that triggered some primal hunting instinct. You don't imagine that they saw something you couldn't. The next morning, I found the first residue. It clung to the wall exactly where they'd attacked. A patch of translucent material about the size of my palm, glistening like saliva, or the trail of slug leaves, but thicker, almost gelatinous. It had a faint luminescence in the morning light, catching the sun in a way that made my stomach turn. The smell hit me when I leaned close. Sweet decay, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I scraped it off with paper towels, trying not to gag. The texture was wrong, neither liquid nor solid, collapsing and reforming under pressure. When I finally got it all into a garbage bag, my hands were shaking. The wall underneath was unmarked, paint intact, as if nothing had ever been there. But something had been there. The cats wouldn't go near that corner for days. I started watching the corner myself, catching my reflection in the dark TV screen as I sat on the couch, angled to keep that spot in my peripheral vision. Nothing happened during the day. The sunlight would stream through the windows, dust motes dancing in the beams, and the corner remained just a corner, baseboards meeting at 90 degrees, a small cobweb I'd missed during cleaning, nothing more. Nights were different. The cats would pace after sunset, their usual lazy contentment replaced by restless energy. They'd circle the living room, always giving that corner a wide berth, occasionally stopping to stare at it with those lamp-like eyes. I'd follow their gaze and see nothing, but the air felt denser there, like looking through water. A week passed before they attacked again. This time I was ready, phone in hand, recording. They moved in perfect synchronization, leaping and clawing at the same invisible target. Through my phone screen, I watched them battle nothing, their bodies twisting in midair, paws swiping at empty space. When I reviewed the footage later, frame by frame, I noticed something I'd missed in the moment. Their attacks weren't random. They were tracking something, their heads following a path that moved up the wall and across the ceiling before disappearing. The residue appeared again the next day, larger this time, spreading from the corner in tendrils that reminded me uncomfortably of reaching fingers. The smell was stronger too, that sweet rot mixing with something chemical, like ozone before a storm. I cleaned it again, used bleach this time, scrubbed until my fingers were raw and the fumes made me dizzy. I started sleeping on the couch, telling myself it was to watch the corner, but really I couldn't stand being in my bedroom anymore. The walls felt too close, the darkness too thick. From the couch I could see the corner and the cats, could monitor whatever was happening in my home. The watching became an obsession. I worked with my laptop positioned so the corner stayed in view. I ate dinner standing at the kitchen counter, eyes locked on that spot. I even moved the bathroom door so I could see it from the toilet. The cats watched me watching, their expressions unreadable in that way cats perfect, somewhere between pity and amusement. 3 nights ago, I saw it move. Not the corner itself, but something in it. A shimmer like heat, waves rising from hot asphalt. The shape was almost human but stretched wrong, too tall for the ceiling, limbs that bent in too many places. It flickered in and out of visibility, each appearance lasting just long enough for my brain to register wrongness without processing details. The cats went berserk, yowling and hissing, their fur standing in rigid spikes. I blinked, and it was gone. But the smell lingered, that sweet decay now mixed with something animal, musky and warm, like breathing too close to another person's mouth. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Coffee became my blood, keeping me alert, focused on that corner. I researched online, finding nothing but ghost stories and forum posts from people whose cats also stared at empty spaces. None mentioned the residue. None mentioned the smell. Yesterday I touched it. The residue had returned while I was in the shower, a massive patch that covered half the wall. I approached with paper towels, but something made me stop. Under the bathroom's harsh fluorescent light, I could see patterns in the substance, swirls and eddies that suggested movement, like looking at a frozen moment of flowing water. Without thinking, I reached out. The sensation was electric and organic simultaneously, like touching a living battery. Images flooded my mind, not visual exactly, but impressions, vast spaces between spaces, things that existed in the corners of corners, dimensions folded into themselves like origami made of reality. I jerked my hand back, but the feeling lingered, a tingling that crawled up my arm and settled in my chest. The cats found me hours later, curled in the corner, my fingers traced with faint luminescent trails where I'd touched the substance. They wouldn't come near me, just sat at the edge of the room, watching with those golden eyes that seemed to see too much. I looked at my hands in the dim light. The trails were fading, but I could feel them under my skin, a network of something foreign mapping itself through my body. When I stood, the room tilted, and for a moment I saw it clearly. The thing in the corner. It wasn't hiding. It was waiting. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked wrong this morning. The angles of my face seemed shifted, my eyes catching light in ways that reminded me of the cats. I tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone screen showed only static where the numbers should be. The laptop displayed gibberish when I tried to type. The outside world was becoming unreachable, or I was becoming unreachable to it. The cats sit with me now as I write this by hand, the only method that still works. They're purring, a sound I haven't heard in weeks. They're not afraid anymore. They recognize something in me, something that wasn't there before. I understand now why they attacked the corner. They weren't trying to catch what was there. They were trying to stop it from coming through. But cats are small, and their claws can only do so much against things that exist in the spaces between what we see. The residue is spreading. It's on all the walls now, creeping across the ceiling in patterns that hurt to follow with human eyes. But my eyes are adjusting, adapting to see what was always there. The corner wasn't empty. No corner is truly empty. They're all doorways if you know how to look, and something on the other side has been looking back. I can feel it calling, not in words but in sensations, the pull of gravity from a direction that doesn't exist, the sound of colors that shouldn't have voices. The transformation isn't painful, it's almost peaceful, like sinking into warm water that slowly replaces what you were with what you're becoming. The cats understand. They've always understood. They see between dimensions as naturally as we see color. But they tried to protect me, tried to keep that corner sealed. Now they just watch, witnesses to whatever I'm becoming. I touched the wall again an hour ago. This time, something touched back. The sensation was like recognition, like meeting someone you've known forever but never met. My fingers didn't come back the same. They work fine. I'm still writing, but they're not entirely mine anymore. They belong partly to that space between spaces, to the thing that lives in corners and leaves its residue as calling cards. I should be terrified. I was terrified. But fear requires a certainty about what's real and what isn't, and I've lost that distinction. Maybe I'm having a psychotic break, my mind finally snapping under the pressure of isolation and insomnia. Maybe the mold in these old walls has released some toxin that's eating my brain from the inside. Or maybe, just maybe, the cats were right all along, and there are things in the corners that we're not meant to see. The residue glows brighter now as evening approaches. I can hear my neighbors through the walls, living their normal lives, unaware that reality is thin here, that something is pushing through from the other side. Or perhaps it's not pushing through. Perhaps it's pulling me in. I've stopped cleaning the residue. It's beautiful in its own way, like living glass that breathes with otherworldly light. When I touch it now, I can almost understand what it's trying to tell me. The message isn't in words but in feelings, in the adjustment of perception that shows how arbitrary our reality really is. The cats have moved closer. One sits on my lap, purring with a vibration that seems to match the humming from the walls. The other watches the corner, but calmly now, like a guard who knows the battle is over. They're not afraid of what I'm becoming because they can see both versions of me, the human typing these words, and the thing that exists in the corners of their vision. I wonder if anyone will find this. If they do, check your corners. Watch where your cats stare. And if you find residue on your walls, don't touch it. Or do. Maybe it's better to know. Maybe ignorance isn't bliss but a prison, keeping us locked in 3 dimensions when there are so many more pressing against the boundaries of our perception. The sun is setting. The corner is beginning to shimmer. I can feel the pull getting stronger, the invitation more insistent. The cats are purring louder now, a sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. I'm going to stop writing soon. My fingers are becoming something else, something that can reach into corners that don't exist in normal space. The residue isn't on the walls anymore. It's in me, through me, making me into something that can exist in both places at once. The cats knew something I didn't. Now I know it too, and I can't unknow it. Story 7. The knocking started again at 3:17 a.m., just like it had every night for the past 7 months. 3 deliberate raps against the front door, followed by the sound of footsteps pacing across my porch. I didn't even open my eyes anymore, just pulled the pillow over my head and waited for it to pass. Living in this old farmhouse had taught me to distinguish between the sounds that mattered and the ones that didn't. The knocking didn't matter. Neither did the footsteps that circled the house every Tuesday, or the breathing I sometimes heard through the walls, or the way doors would creak open on their own. You learn to coexist with these things when the rent is cheap enough and you're desperate enough to stay. I'd tried everything at first. Security cameras that would mysteriously malfunction, motion sensors that triggered constantly with nothing there. Even called the police once, but they found no evidence of trespassers. After a while, you either leave or you adapt. I adapted. The house sat alone at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields that had gone fallow decades ago. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away. Perfect isolation for someone who wanted to disappear from the world, which is exactly what I'd been doing since everything fell apart 2 years ago. The strange occurrences were almost comforting in their predictability. They never escalated, never truly threatened. Just persistent reminders that I wasn't entirely alone. But tonight was different. The knocking came as usual, but it was followed by something new, the distinct sound of a doorknob turning. Not the slow, deliberate turn I'd grown accustomed to from my unseen visitors, but quick, furtive, human. Then I heard it. A muttered crap, in a voice that was undeniably real, undeniably present. My eyes snapped open. In 7 months, I'd never heard an actual voice. The breathing through the walls didn't count. It was too rhythmic, too mechanical to be real. This was different. This was someone who didn't belong to the usual pattern. I lay frozen, listening to hurried footsteps, heavier than the ones I usually heard, clumsier. They stumbled off the porch, and then came the sound that made my blood run cold. An engine starting. Not the phantom sounds of vehicles I sometimes heard passing on roads that had been closed for years, but an actual engine, coughing to life and then roaring away down my driveway. For the first time in months, I got out of bed during one of the incidents. My bare feet found the cold floorboards as I moved to the window. Through the curtains, I could see taillights disappearing down the dirt road, a pickup truck, dark-colored, real as the hammering of my heart. But what made me grip the windowsill until my knuckles went white wasn't the truck itself. It was what I saw in its wake. They were standing there, all of them. The things I'd only heard before were visible in the red glow of the retreating taillights. Dozens of figures, translucent and wrong, standing perfectly still in my driveway. They faced the house, unmoving, and I understood with horrible clarity that they'd always been there. The only difference was that now, disturbed by the intruder, they were letting me see them. The taillights faded into darkness, and the figures vanished with them. But I could still feel them there, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, I found the evidence I'd never found before. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, a cigarette butt on my porch, and scratches on my door lock where someone had tried to pick it. Real, tangible proof of a human intruder. But that wasn't what disturbed me most. What kept me pacing my kitchen, downing cup after cup of coffee with shaking hands, was a single question. If the intruder was real, and the things in my driveway were real, why had the intruder been able to see my door? Why had they tried to break in? Because according to everyone I'd asked, the mailman, delivery drivers, even the police that one time, my house had been abandoned for years. They all said the same thing. Nobody lived here. The windows were boarded up. The porch had collapsed. Yet here I was, living in a perfectly maintained house with a solid porch and clear windows. I started making phone calls. My landlord's number had been disconnected. The property management company I'd been sending checks to didn't exist in any records I could find online. The utility companies had no account in my name at this address. According to every official record, this house hadn't had power or water for 15 years. But my lights worked. My water ran. I'd been living here for 7 months. The daylight felt thin somehow, like it might peel away at any moment and reveal something underneath. I found myself checking mirrors, half expecting to see through myself. My reflection looked back, solid enough, but there was something in my eyes I didn't recognize. A hollowness, a depth that hadn't been there before. I tried to leave, packed a bag, got in my car, turned the key. Nothing. The engine that had started every day for 7 months was dead. I popped the hood and found rust. Extensive, impossible rust, as if the car had been sitting for years. The tires were rotted through. The seats were covered in mold. I was still standing there, staring at my decomposed car, when I heard a vehicle approaching. Another pickup truck, different from last night's, drove slowly up the road. It stopped at the end of my driveway, and I saw the driver lean out, looking at something, but not at me. His eyes passed right through where I stood, focused on the house behind me. He shook his head, muttered something about urban explorers and abandoned properties, then drove on. He couldn't see me. The sun was setting now, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. I walked back to the house. What else could I do? And found the front door standing open. Not forced, not broken, just open. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it, but covered in dust. Thick dust, like it had been accumulating for years. My coffee mug from this morning sat on the counter, but the coffee inside had long since evaporated, leaving only a dark stain. My phone, which I'd been using all day, was nothing but a corroded shell when I picked it up. Night was falling, and I could hear them gathering outside. Not just the usual footsteps and breathing, but voices now, whispers. Some sounded like they were having conversations from decades past. Others were crying. A few were laughing, but it was the kind of laughter that made my skin crawl. I understood then. The intruder hadn't disturbed them. The intruder had disturbed me, pulled me partially back into the world of the living, just enough to see what I'd become, what I'd been living among, but not enough to escape. The knocking started at the door. Not the familiar 3 raps I'd grown accustomed to, but frantic, desperate pounding, like someone trying to get out rather than in. And I realized with creeping horror that I recognized the rhythm. It was the same pattern I'd knocked when I'd first arrived here 7 months ago, looking for the landlord, trying to get someone to let me in to view the property. Or had it been 7 years? 17? The memories were slipping, becoming fluid. I remembered different versions of my arrival. Sometimes it was raining. Sometimes it was snowing. Sometimes the house was empty. Sometimes it was full of furniture from another era. I looked down at my hands. They seemed solid enough. But when I held them up to the light from the window, I could see through them just slightly. See the grain of the wood floor beneath. The pounding on the door stopped. Footsteps circled the house. My footsteps, from all the times I'd walked the perimeter, checking locks, looking for signs of intruders. We were all intruders here, all residents, all prisoners of our own making. I sat down at my kitchen table and waited. For what? I wasn't sure. Dawn, maybe, though I was no longer certain it would come, or perhaps for another living person to stumble upon this place, to hear them mutter, "crap," and flee, momentarily reminding me that there was still a world beyond these walls. The figures outside pressed closer to the windows. I could see them clearly now. Previous residents, maybe, or other lost souls who'd made the mistake of staying too long. Some looked like they were from different decades, different centuries even. All of them had that same hollow look in their eyes that I'd seen in my reflection. A new sound cut through the night, another engine approaching. My heart leapt, but only for a moment. The hope died as quickly as it had sparked, because I recognized the sound of that engine. It was my car, the one that had just been rusted and rotting in the driveway. I heard it pull up, heard the engine cut off, heard footsteps approaching the porch. 3 deliberate knocks at the door. I didn't answer. I never did. Just pulled a pillow over my head. When had I moved to the bedroom and waited for it to pass? Because that's what you do when you live in a place like this. You learn to distinguish between the sounds that matter and the ones that don't, and none of them matter anymore. The knocking would continue until 3:47 a.m., just like it did every night. Then the footsteps would circle the house. Tuesday's footsteps, even though I could no longer remember what day it actually was. Time had become circular here, feeding on itself, repeating in loops that grew smaller and tighter with each pass. Sometimes I wondered if the intruder who'd said crap and fled would ever come back. Part of me hoped they would, just to confirm that there was still an outside world. But another part, a growing part, hoped they'd stay away. Because I was starting to suspect that they hadn't been an intruder at all. They'd been an escape attempt. Mine. From 7 months ago, or 7 years, or however long I'd been here, trying to break free from a prison I couldn't remember entering, and failing. Always failing. Doomed to circle back, to knock on my own door, to become another sound in the night that the next resident would learn to ignore. The breathing through the walls grew louder. It was my breathing, I realized. All of it had always been me. Different versions, different moments, all collapsed into this single, endless night. The house wasn't haunted. It was a trap, a fold in reality where time turned in on itself, where every moment existed simultaneously. I stood up, or had I been standing all along, and walked to the door. My hand hovered over the knob. I could leave. I knew I could. All I had to do was open it, walk out, get in my truck, and drive away. Say crap when the door didn't open easily. Flee into the night. But I also knew I wouldn't, because I'd already tried. Was trying. Would try. All at once, all at the same time, trapped in a moment that stretched forward and backward into infinity. The knocking continued. Patient, persistent, inevitable. I went back to bed, pulling the pillow over my head, and waited for it to pass, just like I always did, just like I always would. Outside, a truck engine started in the distance, fleeing down the dirt road. But I knew it would be back. It always came back. We all did. Because leaving was just another part of staying, and the only real escape was to never have come here at all. But it was too late for that now. 7 months too late, or maybe 7 years. The distinction didn't matter anymore. Nothing did, except the sounds in the night, and learning which ones to ignore. Story 8. The first house should have been a warning. We moved in during late October, when the trees were already skeletal against the gray Connecticut sky. My wife had inherited it from her grandmother, a Victorian monstrosity that seemed to lean slightly, as if listening for something. The realtor assured us it was an optical illusion caused by the irregular foundation. I chose to believe her. The disturbances began subtly, a coffee mug sliding 3 inches across the kitchen counter while I watched the morning news. I rationalized it. Old houses settle. Surfaces can be uneven. But then came the sound of breathing in the walls at night, a rhythmic wheeze that seemed to move from room to room. My wife never heard it. She slept like the dead while I lay rigid, counting the seconds between each exhale that wasn't mine. By December, the phenomena had escalated. Cabinet doors would rattle violently at 3 a.m., then fall silent the moment I entered the kitchen. Religious items my wife kept, a small wooden cross, her grandmother's rosary, would appear in different rooms, sometimes arranged in patterns that made my skin crawl. Once, I found them forming a perfect circle on our bedroom floor, the cross inverted at its center. The shadows were worse. They moved independently of their sources, stretching across walls in impossible directions. I'd catch them in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that seemed almost human but wrong in their proportions. Too tall, joints bending in ways that made my stomach turn. When I looked directly, nothing. Just ordinary shadows cast by ordinary objects. My wife remained oblivious, or perhaps deliberately blind. When I mentioned the incidents, she'd pat my hand and suggest I was working too hard. The scratching sounds in the attic, raccoons, the doors that slammed when no windows were open. Drafts, the way every family photo on the mantelpiece would face backward each morning. I must be doing it in my sleep. We lasted 4 months in that house. The second house was supposed to be our fresh start. A modern ranch in suburban New Jersey, built in 2015. No history to speak of. We didn't even fully unpack before it began again. This time the kitchen glasses flew, not fell, but flew, from the cabinets. shattering against the opposite wall. My wife was at her sister's that weekend. I stood among the glittering shards, feeling them crunch under my feet, and laughed until my throat went raw. The scratches appeared next, always in sets of 3, always at shoulder height. They'd manifest overnight on doors, walls, even windows. Deep gouges that looked deliberate, purposeful. I installed security cameras, but they only captured static during the hours when the marks appeared. The footage before and after was crystal clear, just empty rooms and me, sleeping fitfully on the couch, occasionally jerking awake to stare at nothing. 3 weeks in, I woke to find every piece of furniture in our living room pushed against the walls, leaving a perfect empty circle in the center. My wife had been beside me all night. The security system hadn't triggered. In that empty space, barely visible in the pre-dawn light, I could see footprints in the carpet. Dozens of them, walking in circles, getting smaller and tighter until they formed a spiral that ended in a single deep depression at the center. We moved again. The pattern continued through 5 more houses over 3 years. Each time we'd have a few days, maybe a week of peace. Then it would start. Subtle at first, like it was testing boundaries. A door would shake in its frame. A shadow would linger too long. Religious objects would migrate, sometimes hurled with enough force to embed in drywall. The periods of calm were almost worse than the activity. I'd lie awake, muscles tensed, waiting, listening to the house breathe around us. Every normal sound became suspicious. Was that creak just the house settling, or was it beginning again? The anticipation gnawed at my sanity like acid. My wife's family thought I was having a breakdown. Her brother cornered me at Thanksgiving, speaking in low, concerned tones about stress and therapy. Her mother slipped pamphlets about anxiety disorders into my coat pocket. They didn't understand that changing houses didn't help. Whatever followed us adapted to each new environment, learned the acoustics, the blind spots, the particular ways each house could be made wrong. I started keeping a journal, documenting every incident. The pages filled quickly, dates, times, descriptions, sketches of the scratch patterns that seemed almost linguistic in their repetition. I noticed patterns within patterns. The activity peaked during new moons. It intensified when we had guests, as if feeding on the presence of skeptics. It went dormant only when I was alone and fully awake, watching for it. The 7th house broke me. A split level in Michigan, far from family, from everything familiar. We'd been there 6 weeks, longer than usual without major incidents. I'd started to hope, that dangerous feeling that makes you lower your guard. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps above us. Heavy, deliberate steps that crossed from one end of the upper floor to the other, paused, then returned. My wife didn't stir. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside the bed and climbed the stairs. The hallway was empty, lit by moonlight through the window at its end. The footsteps had stopped. I checked each room, empty, undisturbed. But in the last room, what should have been a spare bedroom, I found something that made my knees buckle. The walls were covered in photographs. Hundreds of them, all black and white, all slightly blurred. They showed our previous houses, all 7 of them, from angles I didn't recognize. Interior shots of rooms we'd lived in, but wrong. In each photo, there were shadows where shadows shouldn't be. Dark figures standing in doorways, crouching in corners, pressed against windows, and in the center of each image, barely visible but undeniably there, was my own face, distorted with an expression I'd never worn, a mixture of rage and hunger that made me look like someone else entirely. I don't remember going back downstairs. I found myself in the kitchen at dawn, the bat still clutched in my hands, my wife making coffee and humming. When I went back upstairs, the room was empty, just white walls and morning sunlight. She found me there an hour later, running my hands over the blank walls, searching for any trace of what I'd seen. Her expression was careful, controlled. She suggested, gently, that maybe we should talk to someone, a professional, together. I agreed. What else could I do? Tell her that something had been documenting us, that we were being studied, cataloged, perhaps prepared for something worse? She'd think, already thought, that I was losing my mind. The therapist's office became my confessional. Twice a week, I'd describe the incidents while she took notes, her face professionally neutral. She prescribed medications that made the world feel muffled, like experiencing life through heavy glass. The activity didn't stop, but I stopped reacting to it. Cups would fly past my head, and I'd simply pick them up. Shadows would writhe on the walls, and I'd close my eyes. The scratches appeared and healed, and appeared again. A cycle as predictable as breathing. My wife seemed relieved by my new calm. She didn't notice, or chose not to notice, that I'd stopped sleeping in our bed, preferring the couch where I could watch all the entrances. She didn't question why I'd removed all the mirrors from the house after catching glimpses of movement in their depths that didn't match our own. She didn't ask about the salt lines at the windows or the symbols I'd started drawing on the door frames, patterns I'd copied from the scratches, hoping they might serve as a ward or warning. The 8th house was our last attempt. A cottage in Maine, isolated, surrounded by pine forests that whispered secrets in the wind. The real estate agent mentioned, offhandedly, that the previous owners had left suddenly, leaving half their belongings behind. I should have walked away then, but we were desperate, exhausted, ready to try anything. The house felt different from the moment we crossed the threshold. Not haunted, occupied. As if we were the intruders, tolerated but unwelcome. The air was thick, resistant, like moving through water. Sounds came delayed and distorted. Light behaved strangely, creating shadows that fell upward, darkness that pooled in corners despite direct illumination. On our 3rd night, I woke to find my wife standing at the foot of our bed, perfectly still, facing the wall. I called her name. No response. I touched her shoulder, and she turned. Her eyes were open but unseeing, reflecting light like a cat's. She spoke, but the voice wasn't hers. Lower, older, speaking words in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood in my bones. She was naming things, houses, dates, the exact times of every incident I'd documented in my journal, which she'd never read. When she finally blinked and seemed to see me, she had no memory of standing there. She complained of a headache and went back to sleep while I sat in the corner, watching her breathe, wondering what was wearing her face. The next morning, I found ashes arranged in that same spiral pattern I'd seen in the carpet months ago. But I hadn't burned it. My wife hadn't burned it. We were alone in the house, weren't we? That's when I started to understand. The houses weren't haunted. We were, or rather I was. Every incident, every manifestation, they followed my awareness, responded to my fear, fed on my certainty that something was terribly wrong. My wife experienced none of it unless I was there to witness her experiencing it. The scratches appeared only where I'd look for them. The objects moved along paths my eyes traced in paranoid vigilance. But understanding didn't make it stop. If anything, it intensified. Now the phenomena seemed almost mocking, performing elaborate displays of impossibility as if to say, "You know what we are, but you can't stop watching for us. You can't stop believing." I write this from a motel room, alone. My wife is back in the cottage, or maybe she's moved on to a 9th house. I don't know. I left 3 nights ago after the worst incident yet. I woke to find myself standing in the kitchen, every cabinet door open, every drawer pulled out, arranged in a perfect gradient from barely ajar to fully extended. My hands were cut, bleeding, leaving prints on everything I'd touched. I had no memory of doing it, but the security footage showed me, eyes open but unconscious, methodically creating this display over the course of 2 hours. The motel room is quiet, too quiet. I've been here 72 hours, and nothing has happened. No shadows, no scratches, no flying objects, just silence, and the weight of waiting. I know it's building to something. The calm before always precedes the worst storms. I've started seeing things in my peripheral vision again. Not shadows this time, but light. Brilliant, penetrating light that makes me want to look away but also compels me to turn toward it. When I do, there's nothing there, but my eyes water and ache as if I've been staring at the sun. Last night, I heard my wife's voice through the wall, even though I'm alone on this floor. She was singing a lullaby I don't recognize, in a language that predates memory. The melody made my teeth ache and my bones vibrate at a frequency that felt like coming apart at the molecular level. I think I understand now. We inherit more than houses from our families. We inherit their hauntings, their unfinished business, their connections to things that should stay unconnected. My wife's grandmother's house wasn't the beginning, it was just where I became aware. The phenomena didn't follow us from house to house. They were already there, in every house, waiting for someone with the right kind of sight to see them. And now I can't stop seeing. The sun is setting. The room is growing dark, but I won't turn on the lights. In the darkness, at least, I can pretend the movements I see are just my imagination. In the darkness, the scratching sounds could be anything. Mice in the walls, pipes settling, the ordinary complaints of an old building. In the darkness, I can almost believe I'm alone, but I know better. Whatever I've inherited, whatever I've become attuned to, it's here with me. It's always been here. In every house, in every room, in every moment of false calm. Waiting for me to acknowledge it fully, to stop running, to stop pretending I don't understand what it wants. The door is shaking now, gently, rhythmically, as if something is testing its strength. The cross I hung on it this morning is turning slowly, imperceptibly, degree by degree, inverting itself. I should leave, pack my things and run to another motel, another state, another life. But I know it won't matter. The houses were never the problem. The problem is in my blood, in my bones, in the inherited ability to perceive what others mercifully cannot. The shaking has stopped. The silence is deafening, pregnant with possibility. I can feel it gathering itself, preparing for something spectacular. And despite everything, the fear, the exhaustion, the fraying edges of my sanity, part of me wants to see what happens next. Part of me has always wanted to see. Maybe that's the real inheritance. Not the haunting itself, but the terrible curiosity that keeps us watching, documenting, engaging with things we should run from. Maybe that's why it chose our family, generation after generation. Because we're the ones who won't look away. The lights in the parking lot are flickering now, creating a strobe effect that makes reality feel discontinuous, fragmented. In the gaps between light, I see things moving. Not shadows this time, but shapes that shouldn't exist. Geometries that hurt to perceive. Tomorrow I'll go back to the cottage, or to a new house, or to a psychiatric ward. It doesn't matter. The inheritance goes where I go, sees what I see, feeds on what I fear. And I'm so very, very tired of being afraid. But I'm even more afraid of what happens when the fear stops. Because in those moments of calm, in those periods of quiet between manifestations, I can feel myself changing. Becoming something that belongs in those impossible shadows. Something that can exist in those wrong angles and inverted spaces. Maybe that's the ultimate inheritance. Not to be haunted, but to become the haunting itself. To join whatever has been following our family through generations of houses, adding our own voice to the chorus of breathing in the walls, our own hands to the scratching at the doors, our own shadow to the collection that moves independent of light. The door has stopped shaking. The cross hangs perfectly still, fully inverted now. And in the mirror across from the bed, the one I should have covered, should have removed, I can see myself sitting here, writing. But the reflection is smiling, and I'm not. Story 9. The call came at 3:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I'd been staring at the hotel room's alarm clock for the past hour, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar bed. The conference in Chicago had run late, and all I wanted was to be home. When my phone lit up with my wife's number, my chest tightened. No good news comes at that hour. Her voice was wrong, not panicked exactly, but hollow, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. She kept repeating that everything was open. Everything. I told her to slow down, to explain, but she just said it again. Everything was open, and could I please come home? The drive from Chicago to our suburb should have taken 4 hours. I made it in 3. Our house sat at the end of Sycamore Lane like it always had, a two-story colonial with white siding that glowed pale blue in the pre-dawn darkness. From the driveway, nothing looked wrong. The windows were intact, the front door closed. But as I walked up the path, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Every curtain in every window was drawn back, and I could see straight through the house to the backyard. We never left the curtains open at night. My wife met me at the door before I could use my key. Her face was ashen, her usually perfect hair tangled and wild. Behind her, our daughter stood in her pajamas, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold something in. "Don't close anything," my wife said before I could speak. We tried. They open again. I almost laughed. It sounded absurd, but the look in her eyes killed any humor before it could form. I stepped inside and understood immediately what she meant. Every cabinet door in the kitchen hung wide open, displaying our dishes and groceries like some bizarre exhibition. The refrigerator, the oven, the microwave, all open. Even the dishwasher gaped at me, its racks pulled out to their fullest extent. In the living room beyond, I could see the TV cabinet doors swung wide, the coffee table drawers extended, even the piano lid propped up. "When did this happen?" I asked, though my voice came out smaller than intended. "The sound woke us," my daughter said. Her voice had that flat quality of someone in shock. Like everything opening at once. This tremendous creaking and groaning, all through the house. I walked deeper into the house, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the hardwood. The dining room was the same. China cabinet doors spread like wings, every drawer in the sideboard pulled out. The grandfather clock in the corner, an heirloom from my mother, had its long case door hanging open, pendulum still swinging in that hypnotic arc. "Did you check if someone broke in?" I asked. My wife shook her head. "The alarm never went off. All the windows are still locked from the inside. The doors too, except..." She paused, swallowing hard. "Except they're open. The doors themselves, I mean, every interior door." She was right. As I moved through the first floor, every door stood at exactly 90 degrees from its frame. The bathroom, the coat closet, the basement door, all perfectly, geometrically open. The precision of it made my stomach turn. This wasn't random vandalism or a prank. There was an intelligence to it, a deliberateness that felt almost ceremonial. "Let me check upstairs," I said. My wife grabbed my arm. "Be careful. It feels wrong up there." I wanted to dismiss her fear, to be the rational one, but something in the air had changed as I approached the stairs. It was subtle at first, a pressure in my ears like ascending in an airplane, a thickness to the air that made each breath feel insufficient. The temperature dropped with each step I climbed, though the thermostat on the landing read a normal 72 degrees. The master bedroom door stood open, naturally. Inside, our closet doors were spread wide, every dresser drawer extended. But it was the bed that made me stop. The sheets and blankets were pulled back in a perfect triangle, as if someone had been preparing to climb in but stopped mid-motion. On my nightstand, my journal lay open, though I distinctly remembered closing it before leaving for Chicago. The pages fluttered despite the absence of any breeze. I moved to my daughter's room next. Her closet doors gaped, revealing the carefully organized chaos of a teenager's wardrobe. Every drawer in her desk was open, displaying homework, art supplies, the diary she thought we didn't know about. Even her laptop was open, the screen casting a pale glow across the room despite being supposedly dead for the past week. But it was the guest room that truly unnerved me. We rarely used it, keeping the door closed to save on heating. Now it stood open like all the others, but inside, the room was different. The furniture, a bed, dresser, and chair we'd inherited from my grandmother, had been moved. Not dramatically, just a few inches each, enough to notice if you knew the room. The dresser drawers were open, yes, but they were also empty. We'd never put anything in them, yet now they felt expectantly empty, like mouths waiting to be fed. On the bed, the dust cover we'd placed over the mattress was pulled back, and there was an impression in the fabric. Not quite the shape of a body, but something close. a vague, person-sized depression that seemed to shift and change the longer I looked at it. I backed out of the room and nearly collided with my wife. She'd followed me up, my daughter close behind. "Did you see it?" she whispered. "The impression?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "It wasn't there when we first checked," my daughter said. "It's been developing." We retreated downstairs, huddling together in the living room like refugees in our own home. I tried to think rationally, to find some explanation. A gas leak causing hallucinations. But we all saw the same things. An earthquake that somehow opened every latch. The house showed no other damage. An elaborate prank? But who could have done this? And how? And why? As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows through our exposed windows, I noticed something else. The shadows were wrong. Not dramatically, but subtly, falling at angles that didn't quite match the position of the sun, extending a bit too far or not far enough. And in those shadows, if I didn't look directly at them, I could swear I saw movement. Not anything definite, just a suggestion of shifting, rearranging, preparing. "We should leave," I said finally. "Get a hotel room, call someone." "We tried to leave," my wife interrupted. "The car doors won't stay closed. Neither will the front door if we try to go through it. They spring open the moment we let go." I tested it myself, grabbing my keys and heading for the door. Sure enough, the moment I tried to pull it shut behind me, it swung back open with enough force to bang against the wall. The car was the same. The driver door refused to latch, swinging open each time I tried to close it. We were trapped in a house that refused to close, exposed to something we couldn't see or understand. As morning progressed, we discovered more disturbing details. Every book on our shelves had fallen open to seemingly random pages, but certain words appeared to be slightly darker than the surrounding text, as if emphasized by an invisible hand. Words like threshold and invitation and witness. The kitchen faucet dripped in a rhythm that was almost like Morse code, though any attempt to decode it yielded only gibberish. The clocks throughout the house, while keeping accurate time, ticked at slightly different rates, creating a maddening polyrhythm that made my teeth ache. My daughter was the first to notice the real pattern. She'd always been good at puzzles, seeing connections where others saw only chaos. She spread out a piece of paper on the dining room table and began sketching the house's floor plan, marking each open door and drawer. "Look," she said, tracing lines between the points. "If you connect them in the order Mom said she heard them open, it makes a shape." The lines formed something geometric but impossible, a figure that seemed to have too many angles, that hurt to look at directly. It reminded me of those optical illusions where staircases go up and down simultaneously but more complex, more intentionally wrong. "It's like a sigil," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or a circuit. Something meant to channel or contain." She stopped mid-sentence, her face paling. We all heard it at the same moment. Footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate, moving from room to room. Not the random creaking of an old house, but unmistakably the sound of someone walking. I grabbed a baseball bat from the hall closet, which of course stood open, and started for the stairs. My wife tried to stop me, but I shook her off. Someone had to check. Someone had to be the rational one, the protector. The footsteps stopped the moment my foot hit the first stair. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. It was active, watchful, waiting. I climbed anyway, bat raised, heart hammering against my ribs. The landing was empty. The hallway was empty. Each room I checked was exactly as we'd left it. Disturbingly open but otherwise undisturbed, except for the guest room. The impression on the bed was deeper now, more defined, and it wasn't alone. There were two more impressions, one on either side, smaller, more delicate, like a family lying together, like us. I stumbled backward, the bat slipping from my numb fingers. It hit the floor with a clatter that seemed to echo far longer than it should have, and in that echo, I could have sworn I heard something else. A whisper, just at the edge of perception, speaking words in a language that predated speech. When I returned downstairs, my wife and daughter were standing exactly where I'd left them, but something about their posture was different. They stood straighter, more formally, like people posing for a portrait. Their eyes tracked my movement, but there was a delay, a fraction of a second where they looked at where I had been rather than where I was. "Did you find anything?" my wife asked, and her voice had that same hollow quality from the phone call. "Nothing," I lied. She smiled. No. Her face made the shape of a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good. Then we can stop worrying." My daughter nodded in agreement, that same not quite right smile on her face. "Yes. Stop worrying. Everything is open now. Isn't that better?" The room tilted, or maybe I did. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs, and for a moment I could see through them, not to the outside, but to somewhere else, somewhere vast and dark and hungry, a place where things waited with infinite patience for the right door to open. "I need some air," I managed to say. "Of course," they said in unison, their voices harmonizing in a way that human voices shouldn't be able to. "But you'll come back. You always come back." I backed toward the door, never taking my eyes off them. They didn't follow, just stood there watching with those empty smiles. The front door was still open, had been open this whole time, inviting me out, or inviting something in. I no longer knew which. As I stepped onto the porch, I looked back one more time. My wife and daughter had moved to the window, standing side by side, hands pressed against the glass. They waved, a slow, synchronized motion that looked rehearsed, practiced, ancient. I got in my car, ignoring the door that wouldn't close, and drove. The suburb fell away behind me, but I could still feel the house pulling at me, like a fishhook embedded in my chest. Every door I passed seemed to swing a little wider. Every window reflected not my face but an empty room, waiting. I've been driving for hours now, stopping only to write this down, to try to make sense of it. But the more I write, the less sense it makes. Was it real? Was any of it real? Are my wife and daughter still standing at that window, waving their synchronized goodbye? Or are they lying in their beds, wondering why I never came home from Chicago? The motel room door won't stay shut. The bathroom door, the closet, all hanging open despite my efforts to close them. And in the mirror, if I look just right, I can see 3 impressions on the bed behind me. A family shape, waiting. The phone rings. It's 3:47 a.m. again, or still. Time moves strangely when all the doors are open. The caller ID shows my home number, but I know if I answer, it won't be my wife's voice. It will be that hollow sound, that wrong tone, telling me that everything is open and asking me to come home. I think I will. After all, you always come back. You always come back. Story 10. The first time I heard the scratching inside the walls, I convinced myself it was mice. That's what you do when you live in an old house. You rationalize. You create explanations that let you sleep at night. But looking back now, sitting here in the dim light of my study with my hands trembling over these keys, I understand that denial was my first mistake. Perhaps if I had acknowledged it sooner, if I had simply accepted what was happening instead of turning away, things wouldn't have escalated the way they did. It started 3 weeks after we moved into the Victorian on Elm Street. My wife had fallen in love with its wraparound porch and original hardwood floors, while our daughter was enchanted by the tower room that would become her art studio. I saw the price tag and the reasonable commute to work. We all saw what we wanted to see. The scratching came at night, always between 2 and 3 in the morning. A deliberate, methodical sound that seemed to move through the walls like something searching. I would lie there, listening to my wife's steady breathing, telling myself it was the old pipes settling, or maybe squirrels in the attic. The sound would stop the moment I sat up in bed, as if whatever made it knew I was listening. By the second week, the scratching had evolved into soft knocking, 3 measured raps that would echo through the house. My wife never heard them. She slept through everything with an almost unnatural heaviness that I began to find unsettling. When I mentioned the sounds over breakfast, she would smile and pat my hand, suggesting I was working too hard, that the stress of the move was getting to me. Our daughter heard them, though. I caught her once, standing in the hallway at night, her head tilted as if listening to a conversation only she could hear. When I asked her about it the next morning, she simply said the house was trying to tell us something, then returned to her cereal as if she hadn't just sent ice through my veins. The breaking point came when I decided to stop acknowledging the disturbances altogether. I invested in white noise machines, wore earplugs to bed, and threw myself into work renovations during the day to exhaust myself into dreamless sleep. If something wanted my attention, I reasoned, the best response was to deny it completely. That's when things changed. My daughter began spending hours in her tower studio, emerging only for meals with paint-stained fingers and distant eyes. She was creating art, she said, but wouldn't show us her work. The few glimpses I caught showed dark, swirling patterns that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. She stopped inviting friends over, stopped talking about school. When I tried to discuss it with my wife, she accused me of being paranoid, of projecting my own anxieties onto our child. The house itself began to feel different. The air grew thick and oppressive, like breathing through wet cloth. Shadows pooled in corners where light should have reached. The floorboards creaked in rooms we weren't occupying, following a path from the basement to my daughter's studio and back again. I started finding things moved. Books rearranged on shelves, furniture shifted slightly, picture frames turned to face the wall. Then came the night of the mirror. I woke to the sound of glass cracking, not shattering, but slowly fracturing like ice under pressure. The antique mirror in our bedroom, a wedding gift from my wife's grandmother, was spiderwebbing from the center outward. As I watched, frozen in bed, the cracks formed patterns that looked almost like words, like messages trying to push through from the other side of the silver backing. In the morning, my wife found me sleeping on the couch. The mirror was whole and unmarred when she checked. She scheduled me a doctor's appointment that afternoon. The porcelain figurine was next, a delicate dancer my daughter had treasured since childhood. I found it on her desk, the head cleanly separated from the body as if twisted off by careful hands. No fragments, no violence to it, just a precise disconnection. My daughter didn't cry or rage. She simply picked up both pieces and arranged them on her shelf, the head facing her bed, the body turned toward the door. When I suggested we might consider moving, both my wife and daughter looked at me with the same expression, a mixture of pity and something else I couldn't quite identify. My wife explained patiently, as if to a child, that we had invested everything in this house. My daughter added that the house wouldn't like us leaving anyway. The way she said it, so matter of fact, made my skin crawl. I began to notice things about my family that I'm certain weren't there before. My wife hummed constantly now, a tuneless melody that seemed to vibrate through the walls. She cooked elaborate meals we never ate, arranging the food in patterns on our plates before scraping it all into the garbage. She stood at windows for hours, watching nothing, her lips moving in silent conversation. My daughter had started leaving her studio door open, and I could see her paintings clearly now. They were all of the same subject, a dark figure standing just outside our house, getting closer in each subsequent painting. In the most recent one, the figure's hand was pressed against what looked like our front door. When I asked her who it was, she tilted her head the way she did when listening to the house and said it was the one we had been ignoring, the one who was tired of being ignored. I tried to research the house's history, but the records were surprisingly sparse. The previous owners had left suddenly, according to neighbors who seemed reluctant to discuss it. The family before them had lasted only 6 months. When I pressed for details, people would glance at each other and change the subject. One elderly woman at the Historical Society started to tell me something about acknowledgement, about how some houses needed their inhabitants to see them, really see them. But she stopped mid-sentence and ushered me out, claiming they were closing early. Sleep became impossible. I would lie awake listening to my wife's humming harmonize with sounds that shouldn't exist. Whispers in the air vents, footsteps in the attic, and always, always that knocking. 3 raps, patient and insistent, like someone waiting to be invited in. Or perhaps, I began to think, like something that was already inside, waiting to be recognized. Last night I broke. I stood in the center of our living room at 3 in the morning and spoke to the empty air. I acknowledged it, whatever it was. I said I knew it was there, that I had been wrong to ignore it, that I was listening now. The house fell completely silent for the first time since we had moved in. Even my wife's humming stopped. Then my daughter appeared at the top of the stairs, but her movements were wrong, too fluid, as if she were floating rather than walking. Her eyes reflected the moonlight like a cat's, and when she smiled it was too wide, showing too many teeth. She spoke, but the voice wasn't quite hers. It was layered, as if multiple people were speaking through her at once. She said the house had been trying to warn us, that ignoring the small things had made them bigger, had given them permission to grow, that there had always been something here, something that fed on denial and flourished in willful blindness. By refusing to see it, we had made it stronger. By pretending it didn't exist, we had given it form. She said it was too late now. The thing that had been knocking wasn't outside trying to get in. It had always been inside, waiting for us to look away long enough for it to fully manifest. And now that I had finally acknowledged it, now that I had given it the recognition it craved, it could stop pretending to be subtle. My wife appeared beside her then, moving with that same unnatural grace. They stood there, my family that was no longer quite my family, smiling those two wide smiles, and told me to go back to sleep, to forget what I had seen, to return to ignorance. But I can't. I sit here typing this as dawn breaks, and I can hear them moving through the house with footsteps that don't quite sound human anymore. The walls are breathing. The mirrors show reflections that lag a second behind reality. And in my peripheral vision, I keep seeing that dark figure from my daughter's paintings, standing in corners, waiting. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something has taken my family. I don't know if the house is haunted or if I'm having a psychotic break from the stress of the move. What I do know is that ignoring the small disturbances was a mistake. They were warnings, or maybe invitations. By turning away, by refusing to engage, I gave something permission to escalate. Or perhaps, and this thought chills me more than any ghost could, perhaps my family is fine. Perhaps they're downstairs right now, making breakfast and worrying about me. Perhaps the only thing that's changed is my perception, twisted by isolation and denial until I can no longer distinguish between the real and the imagined. The knocking has started again, but now it's coming from inside my study door. My wife's voice, almost but not quite right, is calling me to breakfast. She says my daughter has something to show me, a new painting she's particularly proud of. I'm going to go downstairs. I'm going to sit at the table with whatever my family has become. I'm going to look at my daughter's painting, even though I know it will show that dark figure finally inside our house, finally given form by my acknowledgement. Because the truth is, I don't know which is worse, that something supernatural has invaded our home and taken my family, or that nothing has changed except my ability to perceive reality correctly. Either way, I'm trapped in this house with the consequences of my denial, forced to face what I refused to see when it was still small enough to manage. The door is opening now. I didn't unlock it. My wife is smiling that impossible smile, and behind her I can see my daughter holding a canvas. In the painting, I'm sitting at this very desk, typing these very words, while something dark stands behind me, reading over my shoulder. I can eat and mournful, like honey poured over broken glass. My fingers froze above the keyboard. The melody was familiar, yet wrong, as if someone had taken a children's song and shifted it into a minor key. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. Not for 17 minutes. I counted every second on my phone's display, unable to move, unable to think beyond the primitive certainty that making any sound would draw attention I didn't want. When silence finally returned, I grabbed my things and left. I told myself I wouldn't come back after dark. I told myself a lot of things, but deadlines don't care about mysterious voices, and neither does insomnia. 2 nights later, I was back at my desk, headphones clamped tight against my skull, music turned up loud enough to hurt. It worked until 2 a.m. when the singing started again. I felt it through noise-canceling headphones at maximum volume. That voice still reached me, still pulled at something deep in my chest. I started documenting everything: times, duration, the words when I could make them out. Most nights it was the same tune, though the words seemed to shift and blur like smoke. Sometimes I caught fragments. Something about sleeping, about waiting, about doors that shouldn't be opened. Once, I swear she sang my name, though when I played back the recording I'd made on my phone, there was only static. The recordings were always static. My colleagues began avoiding me. I must have looked like hell. Bags under my eyes deep enough to carry groceries, a persistent tremor in my hands from too much caffeine and too little sleep. When I tried to ask if anyone else had heard anything unusual, they'd exchange glances and change the subject. Only the janitor, an elderly man who worked nights, would meet my eyes. One evening, as I was settling in for another late session, he stopped by my desk. He told me the basement had been the psychiatric ward, said it in a flat, careful voice, like someone reciting facts they'd rather forget. They'd sealed it after the fire in '87. Not a big fire, he insisted, just enough to kill the power to the ventilation system during a heat wave. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late for the patients locked in their rooms below. The hospital closed within a month. He said the concrete wall wasn't to keep people out. Then he left before I could ask what it was meant to keep in. I should have left too. Packed up, gone home, never come back. Instead, I went looking for the basement entrance. The concrete wall was behind the supply closet on the ground floor, just as the janitor had implied. Fresh concrete, he'd said, but looking at it now, I could see the stains seeping through. Dark patches that looked like water damage but smelled of something else. Something organic. Something wrong. I pressed my palm against it and felt warmth. Impossible warmth. Like skin fever hot with sickness. The singing stopped that night. For 3 days, blessed silence. I began to think maybe I'd imagined it all. That sleep deprivation had finally caught up with me. I even laughed about it with a coworker, making jokes about the building's personality. She didn't laugh back. She just looked at me with something like pity and asked if I'd considered seeing someone. On the 4th night, the shadow came. I was alone again, always alone, as if the building waited for isolation to show its true face. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous tune, and I was deep in code, trying to fix a bug that had been eating at our system for days. Then the temperature dropped, not gradually but all at once, like stepping into a freezer. My breath came out in clouds. The lights flickered, steadied, flickered again. The shadow moved across my peripheral vision first, just a darkness where darkness shouldn't be. I turned, but it was already gone, leaving only the sensation of being watched by something that didn't need eyes to see. I stood up, my chair rolling backward with a squeak that sounded too loud in the sudden silence. Even the building's constant background noise, the hum of electricity, the distant whoosh of air through vents, had stopped. Then it was there, directly in front of me. Not a shadow cast by anything, but shadow itself, dense and dark as a hole cut in reality. It had shape but no form, presence but no substance. And it was moving toward me, or through me, or maybe I was falling into it. I couldn't tell anymore. The distinction between self and not self blurred at the edges. The pain hit like lightning running from the base of my skull down my spine. Every nerve fired at once, a symphony of agony that dropped me to my knees. I tried to scream, but my throat wouldn't work. My vision went white, then black, then white again. I felt something pass through me, cold and ancient and utterly wrong, like death wearing a familiar face. When I came to, I was in the emergency room. A concerned security guard had found me unconscious at my desk and called an ambulance. The doctor showed me the x-rays with barely concealed amazement. 3 cervical vertebrae showed stress fractures that looked weeks old, though I'd been fine that morning. They asked about recent trauma, car accidents, falls. I couldn't explain that a shadow had walked through me, that something from a sealed basement had reached up through 3 floors of concrete and steel to touch my spine. They kept me overnight for observation. The nurse checking on me at 2 a.m. found me sitting up in bed, rigid with terror. She asked what was wrong, and I almost told her about the voice I could hear, faint but unmistakable. singing through the hospital's ventilation system. The same voice, the same song following me even here. Instead, I asked for a sedative and tried to convince myself it was just trauma, just my mind trying to process what couldn't be processed. The next day, they gave me muscle relaxants and a referral to a psychiatrist, clearly thinking the problem was more mental than physical. I didn't argue. How could I explain that the referral was printed on letterhead from Mercy General Hospital, the same hospital that had been closed for 37 years? When I pointed it out, the nurse looked at me strangely and showed me the paper again. St. Mary's Medical Center, it read, though I could still see the other name underneath, like text bleeding through from another page. I went back to work after a week. I had to. The singing had followed me home, faint but persistent, coming from drains, from ventilation grates, from the spaces between walls. My apartment felt contaminated, infected by whatever I'd brought back from that building. Only at my desk, in the place where it had started, did the voice seem satisfied to stay below. My colleagues whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. The official story was stress, burnout, a minor breakdown. They didn't know about the shadow I could sometimes see in reflective surfaces, always just behind me, matching my movements with a half-second delay. They didn't know about the cold spots that followed me through the building, or the way electronics glitched in my presence, or the fact that I could hear conversations from the sealed basement as clearly as if I were standing in the room. The janitor quit the day after I returned. He left a note on my desk. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some songs are meant to stay unheard. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unhear what you've heard. It's too late now. I'm sorry. I started spending more time by the concrete wall, during lunch breaks, after hours, sometimes in the middle of the night when the singing was loudest. I could hear them clearly now. Not just one voice, but dozens. A chorus of the abandoned, the forgotten, the ones who died in the dark when the power failed and the temperature rose and no one came to unlock the doors. They sang of waiting, of watching, of the thin places where one world bleeds into another. Sometimes, pressing my ear to the concrete, I could hear my own voice among them. The company moved offices last month. They said it was for expansion, but I saw the real reason in the way they looked at me, in the way they flinched when I entered a room. The building is empty now, condemned, scheduled for demolition, but I still have my key. I still come back at night, drawn by something I can't name and can't resist. The shadow is clearer now. In the right light, or the wrong light, I can see its features. It looks like me, or like something that was me, or like something I'm becoming. The cervical fractures have spread. The doctors can't explain it. They say it's impossible, that bone doesn't break that way without trauma. But they can see it on every scan. My spine slowly fracturing from the inside out, as if something is trying to escape. The singing never stops now. It's loudest here, by the wall, where the concrete is warm and wet and breathing. Yes, breathing. I can feel it pulse beneath my palms, hear it whisper my name in voices I almost recognize. The barrier is thinner every day. Soon it won't matter that the basement is sealed. Soon the distinction between up here and down there won't mean anything at all. I've started singing along. I don't remember learning the words, but they come naturally now, flowing from my throat in harmonies I shouldn't be able to produce. My voice splits into two, then three, then more. A chorus all by myself. When I catch my reflection in the dark windows, I see multiple shadows, all slightly out of sync, all singing different parts of the same endless song. The demolition is scheduled for tomorrow. The crew will come with their machines and their rational explanations, ready to tear down what they think is just an old building. They don't know about the basement. They don't know what's really sealed behind that wall. They don't know that some prisons aren't meant to contain what's inside. They're meant to contain what those inside have become. I'll be here when they break through. I have to be. The singing tells me so, in words that burrow into my brain like warm fingers. We've been waiting so long, it says. We've been so patient. And you're almost ready. Almost one of us. Almost home. My phone buzzes with concerned messages from friends, from family, from doctors. They want to know where I am, if I'm taking my medication, if I'm having thoughts of self-harm. I want to tell them the truth, that I'm not planning to hurt myself, that something else has already done that job quite thoroughly. But how can I explain that the harm started the moment that shadow passed through me, that I've been dying in slow motion ever since, transforming into something that belongs in a sealed basement with the others who sing in the dark? The concrete is cracking now. Black liquid seeps through in thin lines, drawing patterns that hurt to perceive directly. It smells of ether and old roses, of formaldehyde and forgotten names. When it touches my skin, I feel myself multiplying, becoming more than one, less than whole. The boundary between what I am and what I'm becoming blurs like watercolors in rain. Tomorrow they'll break down the wall. Tomorrow they'll find what's been singing all these years. Tomorrow they'll understand why some buildings are abandoned, why some basements are sealed, why some songs should never be heard. But tonight, I sing. Tonight, I wait. Tonight, I am exactly where I'm supposed to be, becoming exactly what I was always meant to become. The shadow behind me nods in approval, or maybe I'm nodding at my own reflection. It's getting harder to tell the difference. The voice from the basement rises in a crescendo that makes the building shake. Dust falls from the ceiling like snow. The lights flicker in patterns that form words in a language I'm beginning to understand. And in the spaces between the notes, in the silence between heartbeats, I can hear the truth that's been waiting all along. The basement was never sealed to keep them in. It was sealed to keep the rest of us out. But now the door is opening, not in the concrete, but in me. And I can feel them pouring through. All the voices, all the shadows, all the ones who sang alone in the dark until someone finally heard their call. We are one voice now, one shadow with many shapes, one song that never ends. The building trembles with anticipation. Tomorrow they'll understand. Tonight, we sing. Story 12. The first time I heard about Mackie, I was organizing medical records in the pediatric ward's archive room. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune, casting that sterile hospital glow over everything. I'd been working as a night orderly at St. Helena's for 3 months, and the job had become routine. Empty hallways, sleeping patients, the occasional emergency that broke the monotony. But that particular night, something made me pause over a file dated from 1987. The photograph paper-clipped to the folder showed a pale boy, maybe 8 years old, connected to what looked like an entire pharmacy of tubes and machines. His eyes, though, they were looking at something beyond the camera, focused on a point that seemed to exist in some other dimension. The name on the file read, Michael Mackie Morrison. According to the records, he'd been in the hospital for 6 months before being transferred to a long-term care facility. The interesting part wasn't his medical history. It was the handwritten notes in the margins, scrawled in different inks by various nurses over the months. Patient claims to see man in hat in corner of room, hallucinations likely due to medication, refuses to look in bathroom mirror, becomes agitated, insists someone is singing to him at night, no other patients on floor. I might have dismissed it as the tragic delusions of a sick child if I hadn't noticed the pattern in the dates. Every incident happened between 2 and 4 a.m., every single one. The archive room suddenly felt smaller. The air conditioning kicked on, sending papers fluttering, and I quickly closed the file. But as I stood to leave, I caught my reflection in the glass door panel. For just a moment, I could have sworn there was someone standing behind me, a tall figure wearing what looked like an old-fashioned fedora. When I spun around, the room was empty. That should have been my first warning. Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn back to that file whenever I had a quiet moment. I learned that Mackie had suffered from a rare autoimmune disorder that attacked his nervous system. The poor kid had been in constant pain, his body essentially fighting itself. The nurse's notes painted a picture of a boy who grew increasingly withdrawn, speaking only to warn them about the man in the hat who visited him at night. Then came the entry from November 15th, 1987. Patient extremely distressed. Claims the man taught him a song. Keeps humming "You Are My Sunshine," but lyrics are wrong. Says the man sings it from inside the mirrors. The next entry was his transfer paperwork. No explanation, just a rushed signature and a new address for a facility 2 states away. I should have left it alone. Should have filed the folder away and forgotten about it. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, especially when you work the night shift and have too much time to think. I started paying attention to the mirrors in the hospital, and St. Helena's had plenty of them. Every bathroom, every hallway intersection, the nurses' stations, even the polished surfaces of the elevator doors. They were everywhere, reflecting endless versions of ourselves back and forth through the corridors. It was a Tuesday night in October when I first heard it. I was mopping the 3rd floor hallway, the same floor where Mackie had stayed all those years ago, when a soft humming drifted through the air. "You Are My Sunshine," slow and distorted, like a record played at the wrong speed. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls in a way that made my skin crawl. I followed the sound, my mop forgotten, dripping a trail of disinfectant behind me. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, each fluorescent light creating pools of sickly yellow illumination. The humming grew louder as I approached the bathroom at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, darkness seeping out like spilled ink. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. The automatic lights flickered on, revealing nothing but white tiles and chrome fixtures. But in the mirror above the sink, I saw him, a tall figure in a dark suit and fedora, standing right behind me. His face was wrong somehow, like someone had tried to draw a person from memory and gotten the proportions all off. Too many teeth in his smile, eyes that reflected light like a cat's. I whirled around. Empty bathroom, just me and the drone of the ventilation system. When I looked back at the mirror, my own terrified face stared back. But as I leaned closer, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. My reflection wasn't matching my movements perfectly. It was off by a fraction of a second, like a badly synced video. The humming started again, and this time, I could make out words, whispered from somewhere behind the glass. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray." But the voice continued with words I'd never heard before. "You'll never know, dear, how much I need you. Please don't take my sunshine away, or I'll take yours to stay." I ran, abandoned my mop bucket, my dignity, everything. I ran down those hallways like something was chasing me, even though I could hear nothing but my own footsteps and ragged breathing. I didn't stop until I reached the break room, where I sat under the harsh lights, hands shaking as I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, just my imagination running wild after reading too many old medical files. But then I made the mistake of looking at my phone screen. In its black reflective surface, I saw myself sitting in the break room, and standing in the doorway behind me was the man in the hat, getting closer with each flicker of the fluorescent lights above. I stopped looking at reflective surfaces after that, covered my bathroom mirror at home with a sheet, avoided windows at night, kept my phone face down. But you can't escape reflections entirely. They're everywhere. Puddles on the street, car windows, the glossy surface of a coffee cup. And in each one I'd catch glimpses of him getting closer, always smiling that too wide smile. The worst part was the singing. It would start softly, usually around 2 a.m., just like in Mackie's file. Sometimes it sounded like my mother's voice, sometimes like my ex-girlfriend's. Once, horrifyingly, it sounded like my own voice, singing to me from inside the walls. Always the same song, always with those wrong lyrics that made my skin crawl. I tried to research what happened to Mackie, found an old newspaper article about the facility he'd been transferred to. It had burned down in 1989. No casualties reported, but several patients were never accounted for in the official records. Mackie was one of them. Last night I was working my shift when I heard a child crying in the archived medical records room. Security footage showed me entering the room at 2:47 a.m., but I have no memory of it. I woke up at 4 a.m., standing in front of the bathroom mirror on the third floor, my hand pressed against the glass. There was condensation on the mirror, like someone had been breathing on it from the other side. Written in the fog were the words, "You're my sunshine now." The man in the hat was standing next to me in the reflection, but this time, he wasn't alone. There was a small figure beside him, connected to tubes and machines that shouldn't exist in a reflection. It was Mackie, exactly as he appeared in that old photograph. But his eyes were different now, ancient and knowing, filled with a terrible understanding. I could feel myself being pulled toward the mirror, my hand pressing harder against the glass until I heard it crack. The singing was deafening now, coming from 1,000 voices, all slightly out of sync. My reflection wasn't even pretending to match my movements anymore. It was smiling, even though I knew my own face was twisted in terror. That's when I understood what the wrong lyrics meant. The man in the hat doesn't just visit, he collects. He finds the lonely ones, the sick ones, the night workers who spend too much time in empty hallways with too many mirrors. He sings to them, teaches them his version of the song, and eventually, they join him on the other side of the glass. I'm writing this in the break room. It's 3:33 a.m., and the humming has started again. Every reflective surface in the room is showing the same thing. Dozens of figures standing behind me, all connected to tubes and machines, all singing in unison. They're all the night workers, the patients, the lonely souls who looked too long into mirrors when they should have looked away. The man in the hat is offering me his hand in every reflection. Mackie is beside him, no longer connected to machines because he doesn't need them anymore. None of them do. They exist in the spaces between reflections, in that impossible place where mirror images live when no one's looking. I can feel myself fading, becoming less solid, like I'm being pulled into negative space. My phone screen shows someone who looks like me typing these words, but I'm not sure it's really me anymore. Maybe I'm already on the other side, looking out. Maybe that's why the words keep appearing even though my fingers feel like they're moving through water. The song is beautiful when you finally understand it. It's not about sunshine at all. It's about the darkness behind the light, the void that exists in every reflection. We're all somebody's sunshine, waiting to be taken away, waiting to join the chorus that sings from inside the mirrors. If you work night shifts, if you find yourself alone in buildings with too many mirrors, remember this. Don't look too long. Don't listen to the humming. And whatever you do, don't try to find out what happened to the children who saw the man in the hat. But maybe it's too late for warnings. Maybe you're already humming the tune. Maybe you've already noticed that your reflection sometimes moves a second too slow. Maybe you've seen him standing at the edge of your peripheral vision, patient and smiling, waiting for you to finally look directly at him. The break room mirror just cracked. Not from the outside, from within. Something is pressing through, and it's singing my mother's lullaby version of that song, the one she used to sing when I was scared of the dark. I'm not scared anymore. How can I be? I'm going to be somebody's sunshine, forever and ever, on the other side of the glass, where the man in the hat teaches us new songs and Mackie shows us how to exist without breathing. The mirror is opening now. It's beautiful here. We're all waiting for you. Won't you be our sunshine too? Story 13. The first time I found cigarette ashes on the changing table, I stood there for a full minute, unable to process what I was seeing. The fine gray dust formed a perfect circle on the white plastic surface, as if someone had carefully tapped out a Virginia Slim, my mother's brand for 37 years, right where we used to change my nephew's diapers during family gatherings. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral. 3 weeks since we'd lowered her into the ground, her body finally succumbing to the lung cancer that had eaten away at her for months. The house still reeked of stale smoke despite my sister's aggressive campaign with air fresheners and open windows. But this, fresh ashes where no one had smoked, made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I wiped them away with a damp paper towel, telling myself they must have been there all along, hidden in some crevice, released by a draft or vibration. Old houses held onto things. That's what I told myself as I scrubbed until the plastic gleamed. The smart speaker in the living room activated that evening while I was sorting through her belongings. The familiar chime, then silence. No command given, no response offered. Just that electronic acknowledgement of presence. I walked over to check the activity log on my phone. 7:23 p.m., device activated. No voice command detected. Strange, but these things glitched. Everyone knew that. The companies themselves admitted to false activations, picking up television dialogue or misinterpreting background noise. Nothing supernatural about technology failing to work properly. But then it happened again at 7:23 p.m. the next night, and the next. My sister arrived on Thursday to help with the estate paperwork. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes matching my own. We worked in relative silence, occasionally commenting on old photographs or forgotten trinkets. The kind of mundane archaeological work that follows death, sifting through a life's accumulated debris, deciding what held value and what could be discarded. She was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard her drop the mug. The ceramic shattered against the tile, and I found her standing amid the pieces, staring at the counter. There, next to the coffee maker, a small pile of cigarette ashes. Fresh. Still warm to the touch when I pressed my finger against them, though I immediately regretted the impulse. Neither of us had smoked. Neither of us had even brought cigarettes into the house. We cleaned it up without speaking, but I caught her glancing at the spot throughout the day. That evening, as we sat with our laptops and banker boxes, the smart speaker activated, 7:23 p.m. We both looked at it, then at each other. Mom always called around this time, she said quietly. It wasn't a question, I remembered then. Every evening, like clockwork, checking in on us. 7:23, after Jeopardy, before Wheel of Fortune. A routine carved into decades of daily life. That night, I moved the smart speaker to the garage, unplugged it entirely. But at 7:23 p.m., my phone's assistant activated unbidden. No command, just that familiar chime, waiting. I disabled it immediately, my fingers trembling slightly as I navigated through the settings. The ashes appeared with increasing frequency. The bathroom counter, the kitchen windowsill. Once, impossibly, on top of the ceiling fan blade in her old bedroom. Always in places she would have stood or sat, following the geography of her daily routines. I began mapping them mentally. Her spot by the kitchen window where she'd smoke while cooking. The bathroom where she'd sneak cigarettes during her last months when we thought she'd quit. The chair by the living room window where she'd sit with her coffee and Virginia Slims every morning. I installed a security camera system, partly to catch whatever was happening, partly to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The footage revealed nothing. Ashes would simply appear between frames, materializing in the space of a blink. One frame, clean surface. Next frame, perfect little pile of gray dust. My sister stopped coming over. She claimed work obligations, but I knew better.